And,
Still letting people in. Okay, we are on.
All right, thank you, Bob. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the April 11th, 2022 meeting of the Operations Work Group. We have no public input today, and we have no minutes to approve today. So I'm going to jump right into the meeting. Today's meeting has two agenda items, or two major business items. The first one is our final budget conversation before the budget book is released at the April regular meeting later this month. We're kind of on the cusp of a shift in our approach to the budget. At this point, we're moving from providing recommendation into how the budget is built to a phase where we're like gathering public input and tweaking the budget according to the things we hear. So tonight is really important because it is the night when we can provide additional input into the content of the budget, and we're going to do that with a focus on excellence and equity items. After that, we're going to have a short update on the employee handbook. And that is the business we're going to cover. Dr. Jenkins, before we launch into this conversation, do you have anything you want to say to set the stage?
yes, most definitely. First of all, thank you, Board Member Carusi. We are all going to be definitely missed by you and your presence at these meetings and one task, and just really focus on our children. Our children are always at the center of the work that we're trying to do with our budget, and you'll see that reflected in our discussion tonight. But we continue to be open, try to make sure that we can do whatever we need to do for our scholars, but also for our staff, and give the best to our community each and every time. I'm very proud of the fact that we've been able to focus on some of our key items, looking at full day 4K as we have been, class sizes as we have, doing those things to continue to assist us in being a state leader in terms of when we talk about our graduation rates and students open enrollment, continuing on to college as well. In this budget, we're focusing on those equity things, knowing our own history and trying to just be better each and every day. And I think when you hear from our CFO tonight, you'd be very proud of that fact, our community is proud of the fact that we're trying to continue to accelerate learning, that be fiscally responsible as we do it, but also take care of some of those things that we know historically just have not gone well for us in our district. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Good comments and good way to help us stay focused as we discuss excellence and equity in our budget. Before we launch into the budget conversation, I just want to set the stage for that conversation. First of all, decision points that the board should be aware of as we talk. The first one is that at the end of the month, at the regular meeting, we're going to be voting on Wilson debt defeasance and our referendum bond issue. So those are some votes we're going to be taking soon. We are also, at the end of June, of course, going to be voting on the draft preliminary budget, and the conversations we're having tonight will shape that budget. So please be aware of that cadence as we move ahead with these conversations to structure the budget. We're going to begin, as we often do, with a conversation about revenue and our revenue forecast. We'll talk some more about our strategy for closing the budget gap. And we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into our future funding outlook, because given the state of what the state is doing for public education, we have to be cognizant that the decisions we're making now are going to impact budgets 2, 3, 4 years down the road when they could be difficult. So that will be part of how we set the stage. We're going to break there for any questions about revenue. We're then going to move into a conversation about our excellence and equity projects. We're going to do a deep dive. This will include both repurposed operating funds, which is honestly right now a very small part of the excellence and equity budget. And then we're going to talk about ESSER 2 and 3, which is non-recurring funding that we are in many ways dedicating to excellence and equity. ESSER is the biggest investment, I believe, that MMSD has ever made into equity projects. We're tonight considering $39.8 million in investments. That's a lot to cover in one night. Keep in mind that ESSER is federal grant funding, and the purpose is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. So this is restricted funding. This is not unrestricted funding. This is a grant with a purpose, and how we spend that money has to be in alignment with that stated purpose for ESSER funds. And finally, to reiterate, it is one-time funding. It will expire in September 2024. And it will be supporting us through the next 2 academic years, and then it will end. So those are all things to keep in mind as we talk about ESSER, not unrestricted funding, and it expires after the 2024 school year ends. During this conversation, there are several things for the board to consider. The first one is, do these equity and excellence investments move us towards our vision, values, and goals as a district? I'd like for, at this point, for folks to raise any concerns they have about the proposed spending that's being put before us, as well as any ideas you might have that aren't reflected in the proposal that we're about to see. This is the time to raise those things, because as we get closer to the June budget vote, it will get harder to make changes. I'd like everyone to try to keep in mind that we did do extensive public input on how we spend ESSER, and the proposal that's being put forth today reflects what the public told us about their priorities and responses. And finally, we need to think about, when we are being asked to fund ongoing expenses with ESSER funds, how we're going to continue funding those expenses beyond the life of the ESSER grant. So that's a big chunk of information. We will pause to talk about equity and excellence investments, and then we will finally go into budget allowances, the stock due list, and the tax levy forecast for the coming year before we have our final discussion. Ross, that was a lot, and at this point, I will hand it over to you, and thank you so much for putting together this extensive presentation and taking everything I just outlined, which sounds incredibly complicated, and making it both understandable and streamlined.
Thank you for that, Cris. You took most of my talking points. We could just stop there, but I know we're not going to. But let me get my slides up here, and we'll follow the outline that you very generously set up for me. Okay. Everyone can see this all right? Okay. Let me get my screen set up here. So as we do with all of our operations workgroups meetings on the budget, we want to ground ourselves in our 3 goals that we use when we're doing all of our budget discussions: that every child is on track to graduate ready for college, career, and community. The district and every school in it is a place where children and staff and families thrive, and African-American children and youth excel in school. Our budget planning approach is a cyclical process where we establish our goals and guiding principles. We create our revenue forecasts, assumptions, and projected enrollment, and use these to create a develop a baseline staffing plan, which we then use to determine our compensation strategy, determine how we're going to fund our district's excellence and equity projects, and finalize our healthcare and benefit negotiations. As items in this list change, we revisit and circle back to the start of this process to make sure that everything is still in alignment as we move forward. So our objectives for tonight is a lot to talk about. We were going to finalize our development of the 22-23 proposed budget. I'm going to give everyone a brief overview once again, just to ground ourselves on the 22-23 budget factors and future revenue outlook, given state factors we know and have been living through for the past couple of years. A overview of the excellence and equity project investments for 22-23. A review of our required budget allowances and our stop due list for the next year. And finally, tax impact projections. In our budget timeline, we are nearing the point where we are about to release the preliminary budget proposal at the end of the month. We're currently putting the editing and finishing touches on that book to make sure that we have everything ready for that meeting, to have all board members digest that information as much as possible for that discussion. And shortly after that, on the 25th, in the beginning of May, we will start the community feedback phase of the draft budget and start the amendment process with the board internally. Our goals and guiding principles are what we've been developing for the past couple of months to distribute equitable use of resources to support our students with highest needs, utilize our equity tool for our decision making, and for our guiding principles are allocate resources in line with our district core values aimed at our greatest impact on our district strategic framework goals, maintain a multi-year long-range perspective on all of our revenue and investments, and work to operate and maximize our operational efficiencies to ensure stability in schools during a time of great uncertainty, and of course, build on our practices that are showing data-supported promises for the future. So I want to start tonight by going back over some of the information we've discussed at previous meetings, identifying that the last couple of years, we've seen a significant change in our enrollment at MMSD, and our 3-year rolling average is in a downward decline at this point. For next year, based on the enrollment projections that the board saw last November, we're projecting approximately 150 students will be down again for the 22-23 school year. But as you can see, that 3-year membership average is going down at a much higher rate than 150, because that average is based on the changes over 3 years, as you would expect. And that in the year we're currently planning for, we have just about $6 million to do some intentional planning around how we fund our district priorities and continue operations. The important thing on this slide that I want to keep reiterating with this group is that annual changes in revenue limit is tied directly to the operating referendum that we passed in 2020 and the non-recurring exemptions that we've been forced to utilize for declining enrollment and hold harmless. Again, these are one-time exemptions that the state budget allows us within our planning purposes, but each year those one-time exemptions are removed and they're not able to be reinstated. So we're using a lot of one-time money, not only because of ESSER, but because of the operational resources and the funding formula that we're given. We will continue to experience declining enrollment and these fluctuations in our enrollment is going to continue to have a significant impact on our exemptions and our planning purposes until that number starts to stabilize. Thinking long-term, we know that back in as early as December and January, we identified that in our first pass of the budget planning for next year, that a gap of $2.6 million was identified just operationally for our planning purposes. And one of the strategies we're using in this budget that'll be coming up at the end of April is a debt defeasance strategy for some of our non-referendum debt, which is also called Fund 38 in school finance. We have 3 years remaining on an issue, about $9 million. Paying off this debt early will allow us to balance some of our budget priorities for 22-23 now, and will also affect the operating revenue for the next 3 years. I want to spend a little bit of time also doing a deeper dive on our future funding outlook. As you've heard me state several times over the last couple of months, the current state budget produced a $0 movement in the revenue limit. Our primary source of revenue is the Wisconsin School District. When we combine this with significant downward shifts in enrollment, our future revenue outlook is very diminished because of non-recurring exemptions being generated for declining enrollment and hold harmless. Unfortunately, on top of this, we've been using a lot of one-time resources out of increased investment from state and federal resources. And that's the question is now before us as we move forward with this budget book about how we sustain programming with our operational dollars, while also intentionally planning with a lot of these one-time resources that we know we only have for very limited time. As we go through the Excellence and Equity project list tonight, I want to acknowledge that this is a very long list, and there's a lot of information that some board members are seeing for the first time tonight, which is why, as we go into that discussion later on this evening, I want to highlight that the executive summary that will be in the April budget book, we accelerated the formatting of that document for this discussion this evening so that we weren't just looking at lists on a slide, and that you have some more kind of executive summary level information about where ESSER spending has been for the last couple of years, what our spending to date has been for our first ESSER 1, 2, and GEAR awards that we've already received, and how our planning is affected for 22-23 for ESSER 3 and beyond. But I also want to highlight in this discussion that as we think about how we're using these one-time investments to move the district forward and put a lot of services in the hands of our students and our staff to recover from what we all experienced during the pandemic, that everything we're putting forward in this plan tonight is designed to be a surge strategy to get necessary resources in place as we wait for more information on the 23-25 state biennial budget process. Another thing I want to keep bringing back up with this group is how unstable public educational funding actually has been over the last decade, almost more than a decade at this point, since the beginning of this implementation year of Act 10. The current biennial budget process for 21-23, as you can see from this graph, has had a 0-0 change in our per pupil revenue limit and per pupil categorical aid changes. These have been the primary sources of revenue for school districts for the last 10 years. And having another year tied for the lowest increase in the last 10 years has made planning very difficult. And finally, I want to give you a little bit of a crystal ball look into the future. The last 6 years, let me pause for a second. What you're looking at here is a very simple graph of what our revenue limit total has looked like over the last 6 years and potentially over the next 4 years. Over the last 6 years, trajectory has been very positive and a period of growth for MMSD because of increases in enrollment and revenue limit authority, due in no small factor to the fact that we've had 2 successful operating referendums, one in 2016 and one in 2020. However, due to the pandemic and the experienced declining enrollment for this district, what this is showing is that our revenue limit, even with what we have in place today, is going to slow down considerably, even if we have a modest return to what we would normally call regular revenue limits in future state budgets. So the line here begins to diverge after the 22-23 budget year, which we're planning for right now. The orange line shows the history and the potential future if we had a revenue limit per pupil increase of $150 per pupil based on projected enrollment we have right now and existing investments in the revenue limit. If we were to get a $0 per pupil in the next 2 budget cycles, we now have to look at that blue line. The reason I bring this up is because the landscape of K-12 funding has changed considerably during COVID. And unless we see some consistency from the state in regards to future state budgets, either one of these lines could be real. And the growth we're seeing or decrease we're seeing in these lines would show considerable challenges in our abilities to balance and plan for future state budgets. So with that, I want to pause here before we go into our next discussion to see if there's any initial comments or questions about information so far.
Nikki. Oh, you're on mute, Nikki.
Mute.
Oh, you're still muted.
Okay. For everyone out there as well as in here, what exactly is our current fund balance at?
Sorry, I was still muted. The current fund balance we ended at last year, going from memory, I don't have my notes in front of me, is approximately 16-17%.
And what is our limit? Just curious.
Our current board policy states that we are striving for a fund balance between 10 and 15%.
That's all I have to ask.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions at this point? If not, Ross, I have one. And that is, actually I have 2. The first one is based on the 2 curves you just showed us. Do you feel like at this point you can give us like a ballpark of what our dollar figure of our budget gap could be next year under either of those scenarios, either with a $0 per pupil increase or $150 per pupil increase?
Sure. So in year 1 of those curves, again, we're talking a little bit of a crystal ball dependent on what could change drastically in the next state budget. We don't know. But either way, the growth in that first year is one of the smallest increases we would ever see in the revenue limit, even if it wasn't under declining enrollment. We would have significant challenges, not only funding our existing operations, but any ability to plan for new or differentiated operations that would not be part of one-time funding would be considerable. I don't want to put a specific dollar amount out into the room today, because depending on what could happen over the next 18 months about we know that there's a significant staffing shortages in education right now already. We may be looking at significant strategic budget realignment just to plan for 23-24.
So really under either scenario, either we get more pupil funding or we don't, we're looking at difficult budgets. Is that correct and safe to say?
That is safe to say.
My second question is just about the underlevy last year. Did that underlevy end up helping us this year?
Yes and no. Because we have such considerable non-recurring exemptions in the last couple of years due to not only just declining enrollment, but other state required payments for things like voucher schools, underlevy does not carry over automatically until you exceed the total amount of those non-recurring exemptions. Last year, we underlevied about $2.5 million, mostly because our change in enrollment generated that double exemption for declining enrollment and hold harmless I've mentioned several times. And at the time, I did not think it was prudent or responsible to ask the board to levy for funding that we hadn't been balancing the budget to at this point. So while it did provide room under the tax levy last year to certify with our existing budget, it didn't create carryover in the strict sense of how we normally call it carryover. What we got this year, though, was a repeat declining enrollment exemption that coincidentally was similar to what we underlevied last year. It was still a one-time exemption, though.
That makes sense. Thanks. Anything else before we move on? Cris, did I see your hand? Yep.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Ross, for these slides kind of bringing it all together for us. I'm just wondering if you can explain a little bit more the hold harmless and declining enrollment and how it works to allow us, I'm thinking about it in a different way, that it allows us in a controlled way to contract our budget if needed, so that we're not having to do it. It's not so volatile year to year without be able to predict that. Is that an accurate way of explaining it, or can you explain it a little more?
Sure. So in a nutshell, the declining enrollment exemption is given to school districts whenever your change in your prior year 3-year average and your upcoming 3-year average shows a decline in students. And in a quote unquote normal situation where school districts would be able to plan their revenue limits around these changes, a declining enrollment exemption would be a signal to start reducing costs elsewhere in the budget, because you know that exemption won't be available to you next year. That would be one issue we could solve for without a lot of pain. What the doubling up though is happening is that the hold harmless exemption specifically is given to districts whenever the entirety of the revenue limit calculation, the base revenue limit calculation, shows a reduction from one year to the next. And because we're looking at a 0-0, those two exemptions end up looking almost identical on paper. So it should be triggering another discussion to do a reduction in operational spending. That's true. Right now, though, with the state putting more money into one-time investments outside the revenue limit, we're almost being forced to entertain doing a lot of operational work with those one-time resources. But it's definitely fair to say we need to be paying a lot closer attention to how these one-time exemptions are going to affect our future budget planning.
Right. Thank you for explaining that. And back to that slide, the last slide that you had in that graph with the orange line and the blue line, just looking at that, I mean, to me, when you look at not this upcoming budget we're working on right now, but the next one where it's not that much of a difference, even if we get that per pupil increase, it really makes me realize that we really have to proceed cautiously with what we're adding to the budget that's going to be recurring going forward.
That is fair.
Thank you.
Oh, Ross, we've talked about declining enrollment for a while now, particularly given decrease in birth rate. 2019 was the lowest birth rate year since 1987, and those students enter kindergarten in 2024. So this trend isn't going anywhere in terms of increase in enrollment. I'm wondering if you can talk through how an expansion of full day 4K or a renegotiation of resources to expand, who all we're offering school to shifts the conversation we're having about decrease in enrollment. Basically, I'm asking, by adding additional 4K students, do we cushion some of the blow that we see in terms of loss of enrollment? And is that part of how we navigate our loss of enrollment long-term?
I would say it does. I mean, I can't speak about the academic importance of full day 4K. There are much more people that are qualified in this call to speak to that piece of it. But I do feel that our existence and, pushing forward with a full day 4K program is not only innovative, it is also a valid strategy to identify where we could try and get some of these students back. Maybe not the students that have already, proceeded through 4K and are now in our higher grades, but to make MMSD more attractive, especially to younger families, on how they can not only get us into a full day program at MMSD, but allow the parents to do some better planning during the day too, knowing that their children have a full day program to come to.
And Ross, this is a question that I think might take a little bit of time and teamwork to answer. So no worries if you can't answer it right now. But as we see a decrease in enrollment, particularly at the elementary school level, do we have space for full day 4K programs that maybe we didn't have when we initially started to pursue 4K as an option for families? So
That's a fair, yeah, I'm sorry, I did interrupt you. Go ahead.
is there greater capacity within our school buildings to support full day 4K? And what does that build out and strategy around that look like?
Anecdotally, I can say yes. Due to changes in enrollment and shifts in our other grade level sections, some buildings that were struggling to find a full day 4K classroom has been a little bit easier this year. But if we do return to enrollment numbers from prior years, it would become a capacity issue again, not just for full day 4K, but for all grade level programs of those schools. And it would need to be part of a much larger discussion about how we do facility planning going forward.
Thank you so much for speaking to that. And I think, really looking to what we're doing to support bringing students into the district, especially as there's nothing we can do about birth rates. Although I have 3 kids and I feel like I've done my part. Ross, you have 4, so you've done yours.
I do.
I think, really looking at how we both expand opportunities and bring students into the district, but also strengthen the integrity of the academic supports we're offering to students, I hope are the solutions we're looking to. And I appreciate the investment we've made again this year in full day 4K. I want to thank Dr. Jenkins for his leadership in this board, for your leadership, because I do think it's a strategic way to address so many of the issues we're confronted with right now.
Thanks, Ollie. That was actually an excellent segue into excellence and equity, but I want to make sure nobody else has questions or comments before we do that. Nikki, I see your hand again.
Yes. One more question on the fund balance. I know as Ali just explained, we've had declining enrollment for a long time. Is there a way to get a list? 2 questions. One, to get a list of which schools are facing the biggest drop in enrollment and how much of a drop that is that we're predicting. Is that possible? And my second.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, please do.
My initial answer to that would be the best source we have is the enrollment projections that the board were given back in November, which signal kind of the trending in those areas, and they are by building and grade level.
Okay. Do you have the data? I'll find it. I'll find it.
Okay.
I save everything. And my second question is, I know we're not supposed to use one-time funding on staff, but being that we are 5% over, and I understand the need to be conservative budget-wise. My question is this: how long can we be conservative budget-wise and still keep our teachers, our staff, our SEAs who are leaving for other districts? How do we remain competitive?
Okay, I'm sorry, Nikki, can you clarify which question you'd like me to answer?
One, can we start using some of our fund balance to benefit our schools, school teachers, school working environments, school SEAs, behavioral assistants, and those in the classroom? 1. And then 2, how are we going to stay competitive in this market?
My initial reaction to that is I think a lot of when we talk about use of one-time funding for things like compensation, we've done a lot this year to show some appreciation for staff and regards to some of our bonus structures. And we can certainly have discussions about future bonus structures again. I would still exercise caution about using any one-time funding for recurring purposes, as I know we've discussed many times as a board. In regard to appreciation and retention of staff, it is an ongoing challenge for not just Madison, but multiple school districts across the entire country to keep people in the profession. I don't want to put ourselves against our neighbors in regards to which organization is better to work for, but it is certainly a focus of this district to try and show appreciation to our teachers and focus on our retention strategies moving forward.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Ross.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick, for your question. I think we have talked a little bit before about the reserves. And so I wanted to get back to that, Ross, a little bit and remind us again, we are at 16% and our board policy is 10 to 15. Is that right?
That is our current policy, yes.
And we are at 16, correct?
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I believe it's between 16 and 17 based on last year's final, yes.
In a scenario that we use, let's see if we're at 17, in a scenario that we use 3% to still be within our policy and be able to be flexible with that 3% to move into other areas of our budget. What does that look like? What are some of the benefits and what are some of the risks? And I don't know, Nikki, I'm trying to pick back on some like your question. I'm trying to also formulate a question that can kind of give us a little bit of a scenario.
So if I understand the question correctly, what would 3% of our fund balance look like, and what dollar amount would that be for consideration of other priorities?
Yeah, I mean, not only just the dollar amount, necessarily the mathematical perspective, but more of also like what are some of the implications, the unintended consequences to be at the limit for the limit of our policy.
So I'm gonna answer that question. I might add to it if that's okay.
Sure.
Based on our current totals for year end last year, 3% of our fund balance would be approximately $2.5 million. When we talk about fund balance, though, it's yet another source of one-time funding. You can call it leftovers, you can call it a piggy bank. I don't like either of those labels, but as we're talking through what fund balance actually is, what we're doing is we're actually reducing the cash position of the district at a point in time. A lot of people, when they talk about fund balance, think that it is a school checkbook that the district is sitting on that can be accessed at any time during the year for a myriad of purposes. I think we all understand that this is one-time funding. I'm not suggesting we don't, but I do want to go back to what fund balance is in an accounting concept versus what people perceive it as. Fund balance, as we talk about it in the budget book and in our year-end financials, is a point in time, specifically the end of our fiscal year on June 30th of a given year. And it represents the unrestricted cash position of the district at that time. What's not on display, though, is that value does not mean that dollar amount is available on July 30th, August 30th, September 30th, et cetera, because as you may recall, every year around September, we do what's called a short-term borrowing. And when we do that, we're borrowing money on a 12-month basis because of the way our major sources of revenue are generated as a district. We have our tax levies, which we levy to the municipal clerks. We all pay our tax bills at the end of January. So the primary source of revenue we receive, we don't get in our fiscal year until 7 months into the year. On top of that, you've got state aid. Other districts that are more state aid heavy versus tax levy heavy might receive a portion of their aid payment in the fall, but they're still not going to get their tax payments in January. Reason I bring this up is because when we talk about cash position, we talk about fund balance, we're really talking about one point in time in a year because we know that we're always behind by the time we get 3-4 months into the school year. We are essentially cash poor before the school year even starts. And if we weren't to do those short-term borrowings, we would have nothing to work with. So yes, we have high cash positions, we have low cash positions, but we're federally and state level required to report our fund balance at a specific point in time at year end. I only bring that up for context because I want to make sure that when we talk about fund balance, it's not perceived as a dollar amount that sits in an account somewhere.
No, I really appreciate you adding on because it really illustrated the mathematics of it and how we position ourselves for the upcoming budget, always from this place of borrowing. I feel like I can translate a lot of that to my college student daughter that does not understand that the cash that we have in the bank is not to be used extensively. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So Ross, I really appreciate your explanation of fund balance in this conversation. One piece of our fund balance policy says that when our fund balance goes above that 15% or below the 10% floor, it's the board's role to actually have a conversation about how we're going to get back into alignment with the policy. And we haven't had that conversation yet. So I'm wondering when that discussion of strategy in this current budget, the 22-23 budget, in terms of fund balance and trying to like get our fund balance back in alignment with policy, when are we going to have that conversation?
I don't think we have it on a future agenda yet. We can certainly start that discussion in May if the board prefers. Some of the strategies that we're employing each year when we talk about assigned fund balance is one way to do that type of intentional planning. But if there are other areas in project work that we want to highlight as a group, we can certainly agendize that in a future operations work group. That's totally fine.
I think it would be super helpful in May to both get an update on where we're at with assigned fund balance, and then also talk a little bit about, for a couple of years, we've been out of alignment with the policy, and it is the board's role to try to figure out how to get back in alignment. So I think having a conversation about that in May to start that discussion. I know the final decisions about fund balance aren't made until the October budget vote,
right?
But I think we need to get thinking about this early, given that it's a trend that's been continuing for a number of reasons, including COVID for a few years. So,
right.
All right, Ollie.
I do want to acknowledge that we're not necessarily noticed to have that conversation about our current budget, but I do think it's relevant to consider the rate of inflation at this current moment and how we manage kind of an unprecedented level of inflation with a budget that is basically staying flat, and how fund balance plays into that looking to next year. So Ross, I am curious, is our fund balance currently part of our strategy in terms of addressing some of the reality of inflation? And I know when we talk about inflation, we talk about the recurring cost of labor, but it's also, the cost of materials and supplies, and a series of other, one-time purchases that we can look to cushion using fund balance, I guess. And so I'm curious how that factors into this coming budget.
Some there haven't been any specific call outs for inflation using one-time funding in this budget. In our required allowances, we have some considerations for areas we know are likely to be significantly increased in future budgets, namely cost of district insurance, cybersecurity. A lot of liability and property markets are going through the roof. In addition, we have transportation costs that are accelerating. I think everyone can see what's happening at the pump right now. And so operationally, there's plans around that. But historically, this district has not given inflationary supply budgets an increase each year. We reallocate based on resources that we've carried forward, and we monitor if those resources are capable of sustaining those departments and school level budgets with those amounts. And if we determine in 1 year to the next, if there is a significant adjustment needed, we would bring those forward either as a strategic equity investment or as a required allowances, depending on which area of the budget it's in. But to answer your question more specifically, no, I'm not putting anything in assigned fund balance today that addresses inflationary costs for next year.
Thank you.
Ross, just a follow-up to that question. Is there a difference between addressing inflationary costs for ongoing expenses versus one-time expenses? And is it appropriate to use fund balance for the latter, but maybe not the former?
Yes. I mean, if there was a situation where we knew we had to upgrade a facility, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, upgrade a facility component that we know in a year from now might cost 20% more, we could certainly do some investment to make that happen today, as opposed to next year when we may have to plan for a 20% price increase.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, was facilities issues. So thanks for that clarification. Anything else before we move into equity items? All right, Ross, thank you for all those great answers, and let's move on.
All right. So moving into our equity discussion, I'm going to talk kind of while we go through a lot of these, because I will warn everyone here, this could be a very listy discussion if I went through and read every item on this list. But I do want to highlight first some of our operational adjustments in this budget that we did during our workbook process, and purposely for reinvesting in our schools, given our declining enrollment challenges. We did do an expansion to our full day 4K program, providing an additional 5 FTE for classroom sections at our elementary schools. We have targeted instruction supports for library media, Avid expansion at 2 of our high schools, and credit recovery specifically at our high schools through repurposing of existing allocation in the workbooks. We're also increasing social worker allocations through repurposing by adding another 9.4 FTE in social work, which I believe equates to about 0.2 at every school building during the workbook process. And then planning for the future, we made every attempt following discussions in this board about establishing 10 additional FTE for unallocated resources for needs for enrollment and programming fluctuations between now and the start of school. And that's tied directly to another item later on in this list about our strategic budget realignment stop-do list discussion. So that brings us to probably one of the longer discussions tonight about our excellence and equity project investments for 22-23. I want to highlight in this discussion that since the beginning of our budget planning this year, we knew based on the number of times I've said 0 to you all in the last couple of months, that the majority of our project work is going to be accomplished and initiated through one-time funding. And the administration has been engaging with the public, doing our World Cafe sessions, and with the board, some of our initial framing of how ESSER 3 and our other federal awards are to be planned for the coming years. And tonight, as we go through the schedule of excellence and equity projects for consideration between now and the June vote, I want to highlight 2 things. One, in the lists that are to come, we have everything organized in the major 5 categories of the ESSER 3 award, which is how we're supposed to categorize things in our grant application. But to make sure that there was a little more clarity on the number of projects, the number of items we're looking at tonight number almost 100. I did want to highlight again that we provided a draft version of the executive summary for ESSER spending that will be appearing in the appendix of the budget book that we'll be receiving later this month. That gives not only the same dollar amounts and investment pieces that's going to be in the following slides, but kind of a brief description of each item as we go through this list. So again, I want to reiterate that everything we're looking at here reflect a surge strategy in staff, goods, and services that we have to plan for now to be expired at the end of the ESSER awards. We have 2 ESSER awards that we're going to be including in our planning for next year and for 23-24. We have the remainder of ESSER 2, which we started utilizing in the current school year, and the entirety of the ESSER 3 award for 22-23 and 23-24. To clarify, this is the 2nd and 3rd major federal award for COVID relief that we've received as a school district. The first couple awards were ESSER and GEAR. Those spending on those grants have to be concluded by September of 2022, this year. ESSER 2 must be concluded by September of 2023, and ESSER 3 must be concluded by September of 2024. So the following schedule is going to be presented by major ESSER grant categories for organizational purposes. And again, before we move on, I want to highlight what those 5 areas are. I don't have them on a slide for us to discuss, although I can peek at the next slide just to get us started. I do want to go through a brief overview of what the 5 buckets are again, and kind of give you an explanation of how we've been asked to categorize these in the grant application. Alphabetically, the first is addressing long-term school closure. So this is probably a bit of a nebulous descriptor when we think about how to categorize this in a grant application, but it was initially used when ESSER first came out to categorize any cost generated when a normal in-person education system is interrupted, such as temporary closures, temporary virtual programming, or dedicated hybrid models. Since the pandemic went much further than any of us expected, addressing long-term school closure has really started to mean and be inclusive of activities to develop, implement innovative approaches to providing instruction, accelerate learning, and mitigate the effects of unfinished learning for students most impacted by COVID. So it's fair to say this is kind of the catch-all in this grouping, but it's certainly still important when we talk about how we're going to address the needs of our students under COVID. The second is educational technology. This one's a bit more self-explanatory. Purchasing educational technology and resources for students who are being served by the school district for facilitation of, again, either online learning or discontinued learning in general. Third is mental health services and supports. That's fairly evident for mental health contracted services, staff, and support services. Fourth is outreach and service delivery to special populations. This is also somewhat evident in that it's activities to address the unique needs of low-income children or students, English learners, racial and ethnic minorities, students experiencing homelessness, foster care youth, etc. And finally, preparedness in response to COVID-19. This is more of a preparatory categorization in the grant application, but this is more tied with how do we keep the buildings clean, coordination of response efforts to prepare for and respond to what would happen in the event of an outbreak, purchasing PPE, health education, services staff, etc. While we're on this slide, I also highlight that we have the ability to have a other category in the grant application for either project management or indirect costs associated with running these grants. As Cris mentioned at the very beginning, this is the single largest group of federal awards the district has ever had to manage. And as you may recall from last month when we talked about our early approval strategy, there are a number of services and positions that we're looking to fill for the coming year to make sure that we can not only adequately continue to plan for ESSER awards, but spend them appropriately within the grant guidelines. So that brings us back to what's on the pages before you. Again, I do want to highlight that in accompanying with the board materials tonight, we did provide that executive summary. And first, I want to go through what investments we're planning on ESSER 2, or I should say the remainder of ESSER 2 for 22-23. Many of these projects are projects that we initiated either this year or at the very beginning of COVID back in March of 2020. And as we go through these slides, I've identified where possible, anywhere there's a project on this list with an asterisk indicating that it's either a continuation of a project started in 21-22 or that it was included in the March early approvals from last month. So for ESSER 2, under addressing long-term school closure, we have our continuation of Big Ideas campaign, our new teacher mentor project, and the Summer Arts Academy. For educational technology, we are looking to do some additional assessment Chromebooks for some of our planning for AP coursework and continuation of our digital navigator position and our plan for data plans and hotspots for students. And then finally, continuation of the building services project manager to assist with items through Reimagine Classrooms and our Big Ideas campaigns. Under outreach and services for special populations, we have continuation of a multilingual program and service coordinator. This is actually half the position that we established during the current year. And for preparedness in response to COVID-19, again, continuation of some of the custodial and cleaning supports we enacted this year, as well as our health services plan that we discussed during early approval last month, and the continuation and finalization of our Reimagine Classrooms campaign from the current year. Next, moving on to ESSER 3, these are where there's going to be a significant number of new investments that either we discussed in brief and through some of our early approvals, but many of these are going to be new for us to discuss tonight. This includes a number of assessment opportunities for things like Achieve 3000. I know over the past several months, we've had discussions around ACT and academic preparation. We have some additional not mental health supports. That's coming up later. We have additional investments in building level credit recovery to go beyond what was already authorized in the school staffing workbooks, again, as a surge strategy. There's some additional opportunities for secondary programming for culinary art spaces, which is an accompanying piece to our facilities referendum as part of our CTE department. Some creation of some surge positions for experiential learning and transportation for students to attend offsite programming. Some of the discussions we've had in the last couple of weeks, especially at instructional work group around our K-5 literacy adoption as part of this plan as well. Closing out the remainder of the addressing long-term school closure, there are some secondary program offerings going through Office of Youth Re-Engagement, our Madison Promise acceleration for additional positions and coursework for the coming year. There's going to be emerging discussions around some middle school literacy and social studies curriculum adoption that is forthcoming that we're going to be discussing, as well as some communication efforts for getting some of our students into some spaces to do podcast and live stream video production work as part of additional, not only mentorship, but potential internship opportunities. Under educational technology, we are continuation of some of the software platforms that we're using extensively, including right now, for things like Seesaw for some of our younger grade levels, as well as Zoom. and making some reservations for technology replacement for all the new devices we've been using under virtual instruction and ongoing Zoom usage to facilitate anything that may have been broken or damaged during that time. Leading into mental health services and supports, many of these items were addressed in some of our discussions last month on early approvals around BHS and other programs that the district has already been utilizing for things like Bounce Back. And we're doing some expansion into things like bilingual health, mental health, specifically a Navigator position, an expansion of social emotional learning and SEL curriculum, and also some other positions and services and supports tied to mental health for this summer for professional development for staff, and specifically things like a mental health program manager and a psychologist floater that we're going to be using to address some of the vacancies that we have throughout the district. Rounding out what's on this list for mental health, we have, again, some more of our early approvals from last month, but additional tier 2 SEL developers for the coming year, more restorative justice coordination, specifically for Capital and Shabazz. And under the other project management category, these were all items on the approval from early approval list from last month. Some of the project management and grants accountant and compliance issues that we are looking to secure for the next year. Under outreach and special services for special populations, we're going to have specific focus on bilingual recruitment of staff, mentoring programs for high school girls, language screener outsourcing to do some more of our onboarding for staff and students, some translation support opportunities for some of our existing materials, as well as facilitation of testing, et cetera. And finally, under preparedness and response to COVID-19, we are making a reserve of $15 million for targeted HVAC remediation for those buildings that are on the lowest tier of our building condition report that we've been working through for the last several years. Before we move on to discussion, I do want to highlight two other areas that are other one-time sources of funding that we're doing planning around right now. The first is the governor's award that we received after budget approval this year. That amount was around $3.5 million that was given to Madison Metropolitan School District. Other school districts around the state received a similar award, but it was all proportional to the size of the district. So one of the items that we're going to be assigning out of fund balance this year, because we have not planned for the money we've already received for the governor's award, is approximately $1.68 million of that award at this time, specifically for work in Carolyn Stanford Taylor's department around equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm sorry, equity, diversity. I'm going to try that one more time. Engagement, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other programming for things like Multicultural Student Summit and additional Black Excellence funding. And finally, there's a specific call out in the American Rescue Plan for homeless funding. We're working with their state and federal department right now for additional housing navigation for homeless students, as well as contracts for unaccompanied youth engagement. So that was a massive, massive list. And I know I went through that very quickly. However, I know there's a number of my colleagues here tonight that we might want to have a dialogue about some of the items on this list. I strongly encourage you to refer to that executive summary for any high-level information about some of those projects. But at this point, Cris, we can open it up for some initial discussion about the information that we just went through.
Ross, can you stop sharing for a second so we can, yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
Yep.
Ross. Yeah, let's open this up for discussion. Are there questions, comments? Ollie?
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about how we're using ESSER funding to support assessment, evaluation of student skills, and also high stakes testing. One of our largest investments is about $1 million in ACT prep. I've been really clear that I think that if we're going to invest in ACT prep, we should be investing in our own workforce's ability to provide it in our schools to students for academic credit. I have listened to folks talk about the things they're really concerned about over the last few months in terms of the pandemic, and mental health rises to the top. And yet our greatest investment doesn't seem to be located there. And so I am, curious in terms of the research I've been exposed to. High stakes testing is not beneficial to the mental health of our young people. People have been really critical of the amount of assessment our students have experienced after returning from, virtual school. Why is that investment our priority? Who's advocating for it? And how have we heard from the community? And if I don't have a student who is looking to take the ACT student, right? So for our elementary school students, our middle school students, how does an investment that large benefit our entire community?
Okay, I could start with that, and then Ms. Green can come in and talk a little bit about our plan. First of all, I think that's a great question for us to be having here at the table. This is why we want to talk about some of these critical investments we have, and we have been talking about the ACT and other high stakes testing, knowing that still yet a critical mass of our students will too continue to participate in these high stake testing, knowing that through the pandemic, we have had to a degree, some of our losses in learning in terms of preparation, and it's caused an increase in anxieties from a number of students, regardless of their socioeconomic background, their race, or whatever. And we've experienced this out in the schools and talking to staff, talking to students, and just knowing and looking around us, not on the local level, but also national level, that students have a great anxiety when it comes to test taking. Test taking preparation has also been shown to reduce anxieties from students, even testimony from our own students who have been participating in the initial preparation. And Ms. Green could talk a little bit more about it because she's been working on the ground with the students, with the staff, as we're doing this. And our whole goal is not that the students will go and become great test takers, but it's a matter of fact, they're going to be exposed to this level of assessment. And we want to do everything that we can to reduce the anxieties and give them the best opportunities possible to be up under these, being exposed to these assessments and reducing the anxieties at the same time. So Ms. Green, if you want to answer.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Jenkins, and thank you, President Muldrow, for the question. I will just add on to what Dr. Jenkins already said. I think the point that you asked first about our own workforce, that is part of our plan. And this summer we have, well, actually, let me back up. Right now, this spring, we have staff that are participating as learners in the courses that are running after school and virtually in order for those individuals to be potential teachers moving into next school year where we can run this course during the day. We simultaneously are offering that as an opportunity for our own teachers this summer through the offerings that we will have both under the summer school structure as well as at some identified community sites. So I hope that addresses kind of the staff piece. We definitely want to build our own internal capacity so that this is something that we are taking on and that we are running on our own in the future. In terms of the part around test preparation, I think Dr. Jenkins mentioned most of this, but the one thing that I would add that I think is a very important component is that for about half of our students that attend post-secondary immediately, they attend Madison College. And one of the criteria for students to enter into credit-bearing courses and programming at Madison College that does not require kind of those what used to be called remedial courses or prerequisite courses is that students have a particular benchmark score in the areas of English, reading, and mathematics. So while this preparatory program is about not just academic skill building, reducing anxiety, it is about preparation in order to have students perform well on the assessment, whether they are going into a post-secondary institution that requires it, or for those that are going into Madison College. And based on those scores, as you know, students sometimes have to pay for courses that are non-credit bearing courses. And the research also tells us that the more non-credit bearing courses students take, the less likely they are to persist through and have a degree completion. So I feel like that is a very important component of why we see this as a strategy that is beneficial for our students, and an opportunity to see where we can embed this into our regular school day as a more universal approach for students moving forward.
Just one last thing to add to that. We are looking at other alternatives outside of just assessment, as we realize our society, colleges are looking at blockchain diplomas, which are not necessarily based upon students with ACTs. So it's some kind of mix happening even amongst the college community, and we want to respect that as well. So we're looking at other alternatives for our students applying for college and what we can look at the local level. I just come from a conference, and this was a part of our discussions. How do we continue to use ACT and yet prepare for some colleges looking at the opportunity through this whole pandemic piece of how they can begin to look at other criteria other than ACT, so both.
Yeah, so I am a fan of moving away from the ACT. The ACT has been a gatekeeper to education for a lot of students for a long time. And I think I really appreciate, Cindy, you speaking to the sustainability of this investment in terms of empowering our own teachers to provide ACT and SAT prep within our schools. I think that to me, that is a major factor in my ability to vote for this kind of investment. And so looking at that, I'd like just a little bit more detail about how many of our teachers will be able to go through this training, and how many of our teachers will be providing ACT or SAT prep during the school day.
Yeah, so I can't give you details on that right now. What I can tell you is our teachers for summer semester overall are in the application kind of phase right now. People are signing up for summer. Based on the interest there will be kind of our first guesstimate as to how many staff will be able to train over the summer. If we don't have staff through that process, I think there's other ways we can think about the training of staff. We have right now currently going through it with our after school opportunities, about 4 staff people that are learning alongside. For next school year, we've talked a lot about kind of thinking about second semester as the place to run this course, knowing that some course scheduling has already happened. We've also had conversations with a few people in terms of thinking about where it might be better to do first semester, but we're just not sure that based on course scheduling and everything else that is possible. So I know that's not a direct answer, but some of that information is coming in right now as we see who's signing up for summer semester. And once we have those numbers, I can give you a more accurate count to answer that question.
Yeah, so what I would say is what I'm hoping for is that we have specific goals around providing this and having educators provide that. And that in making this investment, we are moving towards achieving those goals. I feel like having kind of we'll wait and see like the interests that teachers have in this, and then see whether or not this program is sustainable or is available at all of our high schools is hard. Yeah, I guess that creates an additional need for information moving forward. So hopefully we can be updated on that. And then I think the thing that hasn't really been spoken to is how the community or students themselves have advocated for ACT prep as one of their priorities, because I'm just going to be pretty clear here. That's not what I've heard from community members. I've talked to a lot of people over the course of this pandemic, and ACT prep has not come up as something that people are really hoping we invest in using ESSER funding. So where is the community voice in this decision, in this direction?
I'll just say it again, is I've been involved in this whole discussion around ACT for quite some time, and in our particular community coming in now, knowing just taking on the pandemic and some of the anxieties of our students learning, this is a big part of our re-engagement, just in any assessment and learning altogether is something that we're having to try to figure out. So I'm in the schools, I'm talking to students, I'm talking to staff quite regularly. I try to put myself and be very available out amongst the community. I am there in the community talking to people. Before we did this whole notion of trying to come back with the ACT prep, that was kind of like the impetus of my discussion as I was leading up with our staff and talking about what can we do to make sure that our students are on par with their peers and not having these level of anxiety. So I've sat with students at LaFollette, I've sat with students at West, I've sat with students at East, and talked to students at Memorial about what are their future plans and what are the things that they're most afraid of and what things that they just don't feel totally clear about. And they were just college. A lot of students are not feeling the whole part. Students we typically felt out like, yay, college, but they are afraid of taking the next steps. So is that an exact science? No, throughout the years, I try to get a pulse of what students are, what staff are, and I do know in my conversations, even on a national level, this is a huge issue for us, for children choosing. If we look at the data, some students have opted out, taking gap years and going to college. They were not comfortable with taking this test and feeling like they wouldn't have the appropriate scores, which creates anxieties again, right? To go to the college of their choice, so they're taking gap years and trying to be more prepared coming out of this pandemic. So that's about the most. And I talk to the staff, and so I would say I have been one to be out front with it, leading it, and just giving our students every opportunity to be on par and be okay about their next steps in life. Is it perfect? I don't think so. That's why we also talk about looking at alternatives for students and looking for colleges not necessarily requiring the ACT, which in many colleges suspended the ACT during the pandemic. For the class of 2020, we look at the class of 21, we still have some colleges who have suspended it. But as I'm talking to college reps, it's coming back in many places. But some places are still saying they're looking at other ways to enroll students in college.
Yeah, I'll say this. I'm like, and this will be my last comment on this issue, is I took ACT, SAT prep at East High School with Doug Buell. And one of the things he taught me about the ACT is that it's created in Iowa, and the primary beneficiaries of that exam are the people who write it, create it, and sell it. It is not meant to benefit the learning of kids, and it has had a detrimental impact, particularly on students of color, because of the cultural lens that is embraced within that test. And so I struggle with this level of investment. I appreciate, talking to the sustainable aspects of it. And I also hope that if we're, using the ACT on one hand, that we're also letting our students know who do not do well on this test or do not do well in high stakes testing period, that there are colleges that are looking for more than your ACT score. And so I hope that we're emphasizing that just as much and investing in that just as much as we're investing in this prep. And that's it for me for now.
I really appreciate your comments on that. And there are students who are afraid of this whole ACT piece. And we all, from empirical evidence, know that it is biased, period. And I think we have to acknowledge that. But it's the bias that our students experience when they go off to universities as well. And we're having our students participate throughout. But I think, start with your last comment, students have value beyond an ACT. And I always say that we have to take these assessments, but the assessments are not more important than our students. So we want to do everything that we can to make sure our students have the right frame of self-worth about them and their bigger tests. So thank you for raising those questions, Chairperson.
That includes California state schools.
All right, Ananda, followed by Cris.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cris, and thank you, Board President Muldrow, for this, both your sharp understanding around the impact of ACT and highlighting the contrast of our investments to something that's supportive of our students. My comment, I don't know, maybe Dr. Jenkins, maybe it's a question for you and maybe Dr. McGregory. As I'm looking at Ross's slides, we have a pretty big list of strategies, curriculum, new types of programming, staff encompassing in this presentation for today. What does it look like for us internally to be able to manage this gigantic lift in many, many different areas? And how are you envisioning the accountability to our community on those line items? And I know, I appreciate Cindy mentioning that a lot of this is best estimate. So, you know, the board and the community are gonna still get some updates, but how are you envisioning this overall systems of accountability of this large, you know, sort of really expensive and also broad buckets of work that you're trying to lift up at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. It's a part of what we've all been trying to respond to. This whole idea of we have this unprecedented situation of this pandemic. We're trying to respond to it as best as we know how with these dollars that are one-time dollars really in such a short period of time, trying to get up to the level of responding from everything that was listed from social emotional to the academics to the operations side of it, because we're in the midst of this pandemic, right? And so we've taken our time to really say, how do we pivot to address what we know have been historical roles in terms of the academic side? How do we take time to increase our mitigations? And when I say take time, we all know it hasn't been time. You've been pivoting on the in the moment, and still be very responsible, not only just with your local and your state, but also your federal dollars. And so, and as we've been going through it in any organization which has this flow, everybody has to be involved with the decision-making and setting the structures up to ensure that what we're anticipating and what we're hoping to come in terms of outcomes. And first of all, being very safe as we've been with the pandemic, and ensure that the learning, there's a recalibration of the learning of the outcome. So we've involved everybody in it. And I think this is the time that's different, even in leadership, where it's not top down and it's not just bottom up, it's everybody in it co-creating it together and taking some responsibility. I think when we look at it from the student side of it, the parent side, staff, the whole community, we're all in this together. So when we talk about the accountability piece, it's a shared accountability at this particular point. At the end of the day, I think we have a role here in the board that's a little bit different in terms of accountability back to the community. I think the community understands, as the world does, we're really in a time of shared accountability. So in order to do that, we have to change, and we are trying to change the way that we get information in, how we disseminate information out, and how we hold ourselves and how we hold others accountable.
Yeah.
Or in a larger sense. I mean, this is a very complex question that you're saying, and our response is much bigger than just money. It's humanization that we have to bring into this community, this level of complexity, because too much of taking an approach that is has been like it's been in the past causes more social emotional mental health concerns. We can't be so concerned about speed as we are carrying everyone safely to some degree of normalcy.
Yeah. I think, Dr. Jenkins, I was hoping for a little bit more of, and it doesn't need to be fleshed out because I know this is all fairly new and it's incoming, is that what is your vision for looking at, where there's some very small investments, for example, the SEL mental health PD that is, we're, 15,000. And then the middle school literacy and social studies curriculum, which is 3 million. How are we balancing that from an accountability perspective? What is the accountability could look like for us in regards to the community? I get the philosophical aspect, but is that coming through is there an accountability committee or is there a work group that's gonna be looking at different parts? Are you embedding this sort of shared accountability throughout the different departments? So there'll be folks that are responsible to be making sure that those investments are relevant and they are yielding what we are intending for them to yield. What is that? How are you envisioning that accountability looks like? And then how are we then from that place are sharing with our community from the Zoom accounts that we use, from the PD that we have invested, all the way to the literacy and social studies curriculum. This is how we are actualizing that.
Right, and that's a great question. Thanks for that clarification too. And I think for each one of them, as you know, this is a long list. I'll take the ones that you've thrown out in terms of just one with the $3 million. We were talking about the social studies, and we can also look at our right now textbook adoption that we're getting ready to go through. Our process first is, as we've set out, trying to make sure that this aligns to our mission and our vision of what we're trying to do. We begin to formulate our committees to begin to assess what is it that we need to do in terms of our next steps. And in each one of those committees, just like when you're talking about the textbooks, we're going to come forth with recommendations that we're hoping to get adopted here at the board level. And then we have to look out and say, how are we going to go from everything, from how we're financing it, how we're going to roll it out, the academics, what we're going to do to communicate it out, and then how we're going to evaluate it at the end of the day. And each one of those evaluations will have benchmarks. How should we look, 2 years out? How should we look 4 years out? How should we look 6 years out? And continue to bring that back to the community, through the community to the board, reporting out in terms of where we are. And each area, that becomes it. The HVAC, I think it was like $15 million that we had on there for that. Going through our plan, the same thing, doing all of our RFPs, making sure that we have that. That was a huge concern in the pandemic with the air quality in our buildings. And making sure that we get it implemented. And as you heard when Ross presented, he said in our buildings, based upon the ratings where we're starting at, to ensure that we have the quality that we need to have in those buildings that were rated at as the highest needs. We started talking about the socio-emotional piece. We had talked about our social workers, adding social workers in our district. I think it was like 9.4 that were added on there. And that's been a part of the conversations that we've had, starting the same way. Everything starts at what are the things that we need to do to address various things. Start at the community level, start with our staff, hearing from our community, hearing from our students about things that they're saying. We've heard students a number of times say, addressing the mental health. All those things like that start with the involvement of all the stakeholders, getting the voices, and it comes back and formulates itself in a plan. It's not every day that you get $43 million to do something like this, and then to be told that it has to be spent in a couple of years.
Yes.
When you're really doing this, and I would just have to say here, honestly, too, when you get that kind of money and you say it's one-time money, that's tough, because the issues are beyond the 1 or 2 to 3 years that you have. So it puts you in a position of you planning, trying to combine these additional dollars with our local dollars and what's going to happen beyond the 2 to 3 years. So we're trying to look at how we change mindset, how we shift our culture to be able to address some of these things beyond the time that we have. But those one-time things, let me say, I'm not complaining about being able to afford $15 million in HVAC. I'm not complaining about being able to buy textbooks, $8 million textbooks. I'm not complaining about some of those things that we're being able to do and adding staff to address some of the things that we've been talking about. But I am saying that we're going to have to continue to shift as we move along. And I think accountability will come as we move out. We all have to collectively look at it and see if we have to pivot again once these dollars roll out with the local level. And I think we start that pivoting before the dollars run out. We have to do that as a part of our plan right now today.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for the thinking. And I know it was a really big systems question. I think my recommendation is to continue to think about when is the pause to kind of really think about the massive undertake that is taking in our staff, and in their bodies of work, so that they can reflect, analyze on what is the 3-year, thinking around that investment, but also what is the hard evidence that we have that this investment is the investment that we're making this decision, or we're making this plan of this decision that, at the end of the year, that's still a good idea. And then my last comment is, I'm 100% mental health. I really wish that, at some point in the next year or two, we get to the place where we have a very comprehensive mental health support for our students, and that our staff actually feels like they are not picking and choose which students that they're going to see based on whatever crisis they're coming. I know that we are oftentimes celebrating spring is coming. Some of us are, wanted to be without masks, but I honestly think that we still don't know what the consequences, the emotional, mental, and physical consequences of this trauma that we have all, some of us survived. Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. Thanks for the staff, in particular, the staff that is being impacted by this funding. That can be such a blessing, but it's also going to be an added and very different way to do work. So thank you, and I'll pass it back to you, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Cris.
Yeah, thank you. And Ross, I just wanted to comment and thank you for providing the executive summary that does have these huge lists that will eventually go into our budget book in the appendix to explain where all of this funding and what the projects are. I really like the idea of explaining the ESSER funding as a surge strategy, that we are really working to get the services and things that we need in place to react to and address the pandemic related issues that we are facing. A couple of questions that I have are, did we get the summary of the ESSER 3 engagement sessions that you all did? I know you spent a fair amount of time going out and talking to the community. Did we receive those?
I know we did an update to the board after our World Cafe sessions. We can certainly get another update together and put out to be a weekly update. I know the R&I team has been compiling ongoing responses. I can check in with them to see if we have another update we can provide.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you very much. And yeah, just any type of feedback we can get from what the community is saying as we gather that ourselves. I think one of the comments that I had too was and questions is there are a lot of investments in the ESSER 3 funding in curricula. There's $4 million for the early literacy curricula, the K-5, but there's also $3 million for the middle school literacy and social studies curriculum and $500,000 for ELL language supports and curriculum. When will the board, I guess one of my questions is this going to be an instructional conversation with the board and not just a budget approval through ESSER 3? So will we get a chance to talk to you all about, I haven't heard a whole lot about the middle school literacy and social studies curriculum yet, and I'm very interested in what we're doing because I do think our middle schools need a lot of attention. And I see you popping on there, Cindy. So I guess timeline wise and process wise, what is this discussion going to look like?
Sure. Dr. Jenkins, do you want me to go ahead and answer that?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. Cris, yes, you will definitely see this information in an instruction work group. This is a plan for us to do an RFP starting next school year. We're gathering some data and information from our middle schools now. We'll think about what we're going to begin writing over the summer while many people are taking a break, and then begin to launch that process next year. We are going to bake into our instruction work group kind of calendar once we have conversations with the instruction work group chair in terms of the cadence for that. But we're thinking more thoughtfully and intentionally about when we come back to the board with large material purchases. So we're hoping to have kind of a year-long calendar for you going into the next school year, and you'll see that. So in short, yes, you'll definitely have opportunities to engage in the conversations before you will see it come forth in a formalized consent.
Okay, thank you. I guess that, yeah, the clarification I was curious is this new curriculum something we are writing? Because I know that has been happening this school year, or is it something that we are actually looking to
purchase? We are similar to how we are going through a process for K-5. We are going to go through a similar process for middle school and looking to purchase.
Okay, and then will we also see the EL language supports in curriculum? Because I know that's support has really been needed in this area for a while with our Hmong DLI program. I don't exactly know what this is focusing on, but is there any we don't have to dive into it right now, but will that also be coming to us?
Yes.
Yeah, all of the instructional curriculum expenses will come back to discuss. I think basically for the purposes of showing that these are possible investments in a budgetary sense that will possibly come along before the close of the year and for next year. I think that's why we have it here, so that we can kind of know ballpark what we are spending possibly.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. And then just looking at the investments in assessment and other programs like that, one of the things that's on there is a continued investment in Achieve 3000. And I'm really curious if we could get an update on how that has worked at the high school and middle school levels, what we've seen, and how it is benefiting, how an investment such as this benefits our teachers for teaching and our students for learning. And so I think we've used it this year for the first time. Is that correct?
No.
Second, 2 years? Okay.
Yeah, it was a continuation of it. And I know Ms. Green, you probably will speak to it as well. But we have been very intentional because since I've been here, we've been talking about Achieve 3000. We've cut down on it, being very intentional and working with the buildings, and how we're going to use it going forward. As we're continuing with the assessment department too, to look at just all the assessments and what we're doing, but Achieve 3000 is one piece of that. So Ms. Green, if you want to speak to that, or Mr.
Yeah, I think Dr. Jenkins answered most of it. We expanded our use of Achieve 3000 this year. We used to only use it in our DLI settings, and so we've expanded it to more of a universal. We are in the process right now of collecting input and voice from our school staff and from our principals in terms of from an implementation standpoint, how it is going this year, and using that to make adjustments for a more targeted approach for next year. So we're happy to give you an update both in terms of implementation as well as data. And then as we have a more fleshed out plan of exactly what we are going to be utilizing it for next year, that will come forth through a consent, and we can provide a more detailed update and work with Maya on what that might look like.
Sounds good. And then just a couple of comments on the ACT prep and the questions that President Muldrow had, which I think were very good questions about our investment. I sort of see it from the perspective that I don't think students are necessarily begging to do ACT prep, but I do think that what students and families are asking for is college readiness when they finish high school and being ready to move on to either college or career. And one of the things that taking an ACT tells you, I think, Ms. Green, as you explained, is that if you are potentially going to need remedial courses if you enroll in college. And that is something that I just find that we should have our students ready for college. And I'm thinking of it from the lens of how can we use this information to actually make sure that our teaching at the middle school and high school is robust enough to actually have an impact on our reading scores. Like a lot of times if kids are struggling with an ACT or with testing, it's because the skills that they need aren't there to support that. And I guess I'm interested in, tomorrow we have our 9th and 10th graders taking a Aspire test. That sort of gives an indication along the way. So we have a number of things that are indicators along the way. And whether you argue they're biased or they're not good indicators or whatever, we do have these things that we're using and investing in. And how can we use that to inform our instruction and what we're doing for students earlier to make sure that they are ready for college and that they are ready for a career? I sort of see them as indicators and things that we can use to bolster and improve our instruction. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
I absolutely can. I appreciate your comments on that, as well as I appreciate what President Muldrow lifted up. And I've said this before, I think kind of the access to the content of an ACT prep is one of our strategies for a comprehensive approach to ensuring students are college and career ready. I think there's an opportunity to think about also exactly what you said, Cris, in terms of indicators to help us refine our teaching and refine our curriculum that is both at before they take that ACT, as well as what we need to do before we release them out into post-high school life. So I definitely see that as a piece of it. It's one of the other reasons why we've thought about that access of focusing on reading and writing skills as a component versus the more direct focus on ACT for an 11th grader, but what we might be able to provide for students at the younger grades as they matriculate up to continue to bolster their reading and writing skills, which, while that is components of ACT, is also life skills that are critically important. So I think your points are well taken, and I think they are things that we need to figure out how we package them together with some of our other both instructional strategies as well as our assessment moving forward.
Yeah, one thing to that, thank you to Cindy and to Board Member Smith. Let me say, I go back to the comments by Chair Muldrow, and when we ended on the test being very biased. You're not really preparing individual for knowing their self-worth by being ready for college. I'm saying this to everyone at the 11th grade. This starts prenatal, pre-K, full day, 4K, getting students ready to have a sense of self-worth about themselves. These ACT preparations, the anxieties that students feel has been shown to reduce some anxiety. And I'll go back to that. It can't just be about college readiness. A test score cannot tell you you're ready for college or not. And we also have to be honest in acknowledging the damage that has occurred for many of our students before they get to 11th grade. So what we're really doing here is giving a meaningful environment to encourage them, to let them know, yes, you can go on. The score itself may not necessarily dictate if you're college ready per se. The work that we do, and this is why we adopted the early literacy philosophy that we have. It's early literacy and beyond, you recall, and we collaborating with UW on that as well. Early literacy and beyond. The more we can capture our students early and change their mindsets, the more we can change the expectation for our students in terms of how we believe that they can learn, the better prepared they're going to be. Then when they get to this point of any of these assessments, they will not only be ready for the assessment, but they'll be ready to thrive in life. And I just want to make sure I point that out too. It's not just about the assessments for our students. This does still come back to self-worth and how one another see how adults see our students and how students see themselves.
Great, thank you. And again, I see this as one point in time and one thing we're investing in, and we have to do a lot of work on the front end to get more students prepared. And on that note, I guess one of the things that you asked us for is if there are things that are not covered in this that we might have suggestions on. And one thing that I've seen sort of coming out in the research that has been possibly shown to be beneficial for students is high quality, high dosage tutoring. That can significantly affect academic gains for students. Acknowledging the challenges that are out there with scaling any type of initiative like that. But I'm just wondering if we have thought about that at all as another investment that we could do with our ESSER funding.
Most definitely. Thank you too for that. When you see the investment, we're making even an expanded Avid, which has also been proven to be a high quality strategy. There are other things. I'm just using that as one because that's what we've chosen to engage with as well. But we definitely have to continue to look at those things in terms of high quality tutoring that is out there in terms of in the literature, the high quality tutoring. What we're doing in school aligned with the tutoring that we're receiving from the outside too. That does make a difference so that you're not teaching things differently in mathematics or even from a grammatical standpoint.
Yeah, and if there's more opportunities to either partner or scale that, I think we should take a serious look at what that might look like going forward in the next year, if that's possible. And then my last comment, and then I'll be done, is I'm finding it difficult, Ross, and it's to kind of decipher in here what is going to be recurring funds that we're investing in for the ESSER 3 funding and what is truly one-time funds. Is there a way to kind of tease that out and see where we might, like, total dollar amount need to be keeping that in mind for future budgets?
So I'll say it like this. Nothing in the ESSER 2 or 3 plan that we're talking about tonight is designed to create a cliff. If there are items 1-2 years from now, as the money starts to run out, that we need to either discuss as a group or continue funding through strategic budget repurposing, we will have those discussions in those future years. But everyone who submitted a project on this list and everything we put together on this list, we said up front that nothing on here can be depended on in 2 years, which is why we're calling it a surge strategy, because we were hoping that a lot of the services and positions we're creating, we won't need in the same quantities 2 years from now than we will now. That might change, but at this point, I'm not signaling that anything on here is designed to create that cliff. If it was, I'd be concerned. I mean, there are certainly services that we're going to be creating over the next couple of years with this money that are going to be beneficial to students. I'm not saying that we're being bad stewards of this money, but we have to recognize that unless we have a better source of recurring authority to work with, either from the state revenue limit or other recurring sources, we must be prepared for these programs to end in 2 years.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
All right, thanks, Cris. Nikki, followed by Maya, and then Sabian.
Yes, I voted for the ACT budget solely for financial reasons, because there's some individuals who can't afford it. But I would like to make one thing clear. As someone who had to take the test 3 times to be able to get into college, once because the company screwed up my disability accommodations so badly that they were non-existent, I can realize the idea of putting your entire hope on one test. I don't want to do that to our students. I want to build confidence, but I know that the tests have biases for Black and brown students. I know they have it for disabled students, because anything that's based originally off the IQ movement was based out of the eugenics movement. Plain and simple, which was created in 1890s by a French doctor on who can go to school and who can be institutionalized. This isn't measuring our students' worth, it's measuring their deficits. However, as long as scholarships are needed, I don't see another way, and I wish I did. And I hope we could create a program and a grow your own that won't require the use of that. But until scholarships don't require it, and entrance doesn't require it, I don't see a way of phasing it out as much as I want to and as much as I hate it.
Thank you, Nikki. Maya?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Cindy, for stating earlier about making sure that we're having staff. I know that was last time we had this conversation. That was kind of one of my concerns of how do we make it sustainable and utilize the funding and invest it back into our schools and teachers. Similarly to remember Vandermeulen, voting on it was more so around how do we invest in the students that need to take it now? There are schools that require the SAT and the ACT. I know that more schools are moving away from it, including some California state universities and schools that basically got rid of them. And so as we are making ways, I'm thankful that our President Mildred also mentioned, like, how are we also making sure that students know the options if they're not able to take it. I think one thing is that I wanted to ask is how are we, so right now it's $1 million. As we are projecting in the future, are we looking to possibly continue supporting at that level? Or how are we kind of thinking about it in the future to make it more sustainable? Or like how much investment are we looking to do?
Yeah, so I can start with that answer and I'll allow Dr. Jenkins to chime in. Thank you, Board Member Pearson. One, if you remember to the board, we provided in the weekly update an evaluation plan in terms of how we want to continuously learn from our students and learn from their experiences to reflect and adjust, and also closely pay attention to who is taking advantage of this opportunity. So we are using that as we continue to go. We still have our first survey out for our first cohort. That's going to be a critical component in thinking about how we continue to adjust the funds we're allocating for this moving forward, whether exhausting all of them or reducing it based on what's happening. So that's the first thing. Second thing is these funds, a portion of these funds will definitely be supporting transportation, food, and other components as we think about the community spaces that we are providing for students to have easier access or even sometimes more access to places where they have better relationships and better connections. So we're thinking about that as well. And then in terms of long-term, again, we want to bake this into an opportunity that exists within our school course offerings as well as within our staffing plans. So as we're continuing to have our teachers learn alongside some of the vendors, they will then be able to take this on their own, which in turn creates sustainability and also reduces costs across the board. We used to run ACT courses during the school day, and we kind of shifted from that. And so again, this is an opportunity to see how it can be built into our staffing plans and our course offerings moving forward. Again, using that evaluation cycle and reflecting and adjusting is a critical point to how we'll make decisions.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know, I mean, Ali and I were in school at the same time. I remember them being offered by our teachers. And one thing that I would just caution is that when that was the case, the equity issue was definitely there. And so to be honest, I didn't even know that they were having classes for ACT until like after. I took the ACT like twice. And so I would just, make sure that, it is equitable across the schools and that students have access to it no matter what, and that we're making sure that we're telling folks about it. So I do think that could be an issue.
Thank you. I think that's a really important component to mention and to be paying attention to.
Thanks.
I think all this, that's a great question too. Woodman Pearson, and the explanation is spot on. One of the things I think we all need to keep in mind, and as Ross has been doing his presentations about where we are with the ESSA dollars and what could potentially happen because of the fact from the Joint Finance Committee, we had a 0 and 0, and what we anticipate is going to happen in the future. We have to make sure it's known in public education if we want all these great things to continue to happen. There has to be some support at the state level. When you were in high school and those classes were cut, we had to make choices between what we want to offer and not offer because of the funding, what happens from school, which impacts a local level, which impacts individuals considering whether or not they want those services, they sustain them through referendums, which is becoming very costly. So we have to start this discussion and take a long view for where we are and what we're going to do. So when we talk about sustainability, it's a harsh reality, but we do have to think about that. But I think that when we have these courses, they have to be during the day, and we have to communicate to all of our families about this. That wasn't unintentional. That was intentional. Some students receive certain services and some students don't. So that's what I would say. We have to have an equity lens as we're thinking about this and anything else for accelerated learning.
Thank you. Thanks, Maya. Savian and then Gordon.
Thank you so much. So I have roughly 3 group questions. This first one is around our 2.93 million investment in mental health services and support. So I'm wondering if we have any projection in terms of how these investments will decrease our psych to student and counselor to student ratios in our schools.
Let's have Dr. Getchell, she's on here, speak to that. And they've been doing a wonderful job in terms of trying to make sure we respond to that area. Dr. Esser is here as well.
Sorry, I was just going to ask if you could repeat it because I heard psych and social work, but I didn't hear the connected aspect of the question. So if you wouldn't mind, I apologize.
No worries. Can anyone speak to how the mental health services and support investment will decrease the student to psych and student to counselor ratios in our schools?
Yeah, I think I'm probably best to take this one right now, but Sarah Kennedy, please don't hesitate to jump in. I'm throwing my pen around over here. Right now we are adding 9.4 FTE in social work to our school-based staff. That has been dispersed on a needs basis, looking at a variety of data points. That still leaves our psych ratio, or I'm sorry, our social work ratio at about 50 social workers under what is recommended by the National Association. We are not adding additional psychs with the exception of the floater psych. And the floater psych is intended to serve some of the staffing related shortages. So if there's no psych at a school, we need to send somebody to do an evaluation or to sub. So that won't necessarily, it takes our ratio down overall, but it's not necessarily like our school-based ratios going down. Our psychs are about 9.3, I believe, FTE away from their ratio of 1 to 500. And then lastly, we are almost at a ratio of 1 to 300 or 350. Cindy, jump in here if you can think of, if you know the concrete number, I just can't remember, for our counselors. We have a couple of middle schools that aren't quite there, but we're much closer. That being said, the ratio that is recommended is 1 to 250. So we still have work to do throughout the disciplines in our district.
Got it. Thank you. Then my last question related to this is that I see the investment in mental health summer professional development. Is that so our school-based staff can be prepared to have trauma-informed care for students?
Yes, and again, Sarah, Kristen, please don't hesitate to jump in. But there are some very foundational practices that are critical for our student services team members. So thinking about assessment, for example, how to conduct a suicide risk assessment, how to conduct a violence risk assessment, how to support and safety plan as a result. So we want to ensure that our school-based staff have the opportunity in the summer to get those foundational learning opportunities. That being said, because they're foundational, the options or the training will also be available for folks during the school year, but we hope to get as many people trained in the summer as possible. We will also have additional strands when you think about professional development that allow people to go deeper into areas of interest and expertise as well. So it's both foundational and to grow a diverse group of practitioners that serve our students across the district.
Got it. Thank you so much. My next 2 questions are related to the homelessness funding. The last comprehensive study that I'm aware of was from 2019 from Briar Patch, which is that around 300 young people in Dane County any given day are homeless. I cannot find a study since then, and I can only assume that the number has unfortunately gone up. And so I'm wondering, with this investment, how and if and how are we coordinating with the county? And then what services will be available for those students, and how can they access those services?
I can take that question. Good evening. So there were two projects under the ARP homeless funding that we had proposed. And so are you talking about the unaccompanied youth project?
Both the housing Navigator contract, I guess that'd be engagement with families, and then the youth engagement one as well.
Right. So let's start with the Housing Navigator project. So I know you're aware of this, and many people on this in the meeting is aware as well, that we have the majority of our families in Madison experiencing homelessness are doubled up. So they're living with others due to economic hardship. And we also know that the Housing and Urban Development definition of homelessness does not recognize our doubled up families. So we wanted to look into a way where we could provide some resources to the predominantly doubled up families in Madison, where we know our homelessness is the majority of our homelessness. So doubled up families and families self-paying in hotels, they are not getting on that housing prioritization list like other families are who are seeking shelter. So we have families who could be brand new to Madison, coming from other states, other cities, and if they stay in shelter, they're prioritized for housing, while our doubled up and self-paying homeless families in Madison are not. So we really wanted to make sure that we had a resource in place to provide some housing navigation supports for those families. So more to come on that. We are still investigating, but we wanted to definitely set aside funds and get a project in place. Talking about the numbers with Briar Patch, you're right. I mean, I don't think there's been significant studies when we're talking about our unaccompanied youth numbers, but we do know in Madison that we are extremely underreported. Our students who are unaccompanied for a variety of reasons are afraid to self-identify because they're not aware of what their rights are or what that could mean for them. And we also know that re-engagement back into the school setting due to the pandemic has been very difficult for the majority of our students and families, let alone our students who are unaccompanied. So we wanted to make sure that we had engagement strategies in place for those students. We have been in conversations with Briar Patch about what that could look like. So we are working with them on a potential project, but again, more to come on that as well. Again, this is just a way for us to make sure that we were setting aside funds in areas where we knew we needed those additional supports for our students and families.
Got it. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your expansive understanding, especially of families doubling up. Homelessness looks very different for a lot of people.
Yes.
Myself personally, it was eviction to eviction, or staying with a friend for a few weeks or a month or so. And so things are complex, and I'm glad that you've taken that expansive, holistic approach to that. One more question and then a comment. I see that the Department of Engagement, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is getting some investment here. Our activities under that department really describe what we heard from in our last instruction work group meeting with Dr. Sanford Taylor. Thank you. So that's exciting to hear. Things like grow your own projects like grow your own, or the neighborhood builders, things like that are really good to hear. And then my last comment is partially related to our last discussion with revenue sources and with all of our concern about the sustainability about all of our investments, is that when we think about making investments that the community wants, and you look at the history of MMSD, it's been about every 4 or 5 years that we look at a referendum. And I think that those things are not off the table in the next decade. And so I think those are things that we have to think about when we are making investments that we know that our students need and deserve, as well as our staff. So thank you.
Thanks, Xavier. Gordon?
Yes, I have a comment, then I will go into a question for Ms. Green. With my comment is that I think with ACT, it's regarding the ACT prep course. I just have to say is that while I understand the history behind, ACT and then other standardized tests, when it comes to college admissions, I do see the value and still giving our students the option to partake in the service. At the end of the day, there are still colleges who may require it or even scholarships. And I say just giving them the opportunity doesn't necessarily hurt, especially since it's still the requirement for many of those services. I would just say that it's just important that we just continue to remain, very effective in the way that the course is being taught and how well it is integrated into the students' school day. One thing I will also mention is that in a lot of places, whereas they might not have access to a lot of extracurricular activities or any other support, the ACT can actually help weigh in on the application more. I do know with the optional testing, there's a lot more weight in regards to your essays. And everyone might not be as of a strong writer or have any very substantial circumstances that can help them stand out in their essays. And that can be a time where, a standardized test score can help make up for that. The same as if they're in an area where maybe they can't, do a lot of extracurricular activities and they have to just work to provide for their family. I would say if the ACT prep course is embedded into their school day and they have time to really study and do well on the test, that can also make up for the extracurricular portion that may be lacking in their application. So again, I don't see a problem with not giving our students a choice. If they want to go ahead with ACT and get the course a try, then so be it. I believe that a lot of students can actually benefit from this. I know there are a lot of students who I know who I'm personally friends with who spent a lot of money on these prep courses, and there are still people throughout this nation who are spending a lot of money to do well on those courses. And the fact that our district is trying to offer it for free and the vendors have proven to be credible in this area, then I further see the benefit in offering this course to our students. But my question is that how can we ensure, that when students are enrolled in the course, that they continue to remain very active with, in the course, like we can retain their engagement. And also that, there's it can get kind of challenging sometimes. I do admit when I did my ACT prep course. So how can we make sure that they stay engaged and ready?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for your comments, Gordon. And I think that part of our evaluation plan of that continuous reflection and adjustment along the way is going to be really important. As I mentioned, we have a survey out right now for students to understand their experience, both from the actual course experience, as well as how this course did or did not support their mental health, their anxiety and test taking and all of that. That information is going to be used as we continuously adjust our plan moving forward. So I think that's one way. I think the second way right now, we have a check-in every single week with all of our school points of contacts and the individuals that are directly at the school supporting this work. So we're learning each week kind of what's going well and what's not. And so those points of contact have been really critical for us to kind of understand what the experiences are on a day-to-day basis. So I think those are two things. I think in addition to that, when we have our own staff that will be running this, I think just like any teacher does, you have to make adjustments in the moment and kind of pivot based on what is happening with your students. So I think that knowing your students well and knowing what their needs are is going to be something that will definitely play into it going forward. Thank you.
All right. That sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. I will jump in with just a couple things. First of all, I want to take a little bit of a step back from ACT. It's $1 million of a almost $40 million plan that we're talking about tonight. And I want to acknowledge the challenge for this district of coming up for a plan for $40 million in one-time funding when we are struggling with recurring dollars, when our per pupil revenue is flat and the curve of that in the best case scenario is going to stay flat for a while. This is hard. And I really want to thank the administration for taking on this challenge and coming forward to us with a complicated and comprehensive plan for how to meet the needs of our students at a difficult time with funding that's not going to continue past the next couple of years. With that said, I want to hone in on a couple of areas of the plan we've been presented and just get a little bit more information. The first one is instruction, our instructional responses to long-term school closure and resulting learning loss. Again, I don't want to delve into the ACT here, but rather step back. And in my observation of what's been going on in classrooms this year in MMSD, we have a lot of kids who are experiencing learning loss because they weren't able to engage with school last year. And a lot of what has happened to address that is teachers taking extra time to meet the individual needs of students who need to catch up. It's not paying any company or any consultant to do any work for us. It is paying our own staff to do the work of helping all kids get caught up. And it's hard, hard work. You can talk to any teacher in this district about how challenging it is to work one-on-one with students who need that extra attention, not only to catch up, but also because they need the human contact and the relationships in their lives at a really difficult time. So one idea for spending this money that I brought up that I don't see reflected here, and I think we could still do at the elementary level, would be to take some of this ESSER money and actually invest in some either long-term subs or LTE teaching positions to temporarily both reduce class sizes and also train up some teachers who could then step into the ongoing vacancy problem we have. So if we use some ESSER money for a little teaching surge strategy to perhaps, especially at the elementary level, reduce some class sizes, give children more opportunities to get that one-on-one help they need because their teachers are responsible for fewer kids, particularly in sections where we're looking at 20 plus kids in a section. And then those teachers who we've hired, whether it's long-term subs or LTEs, almost certainly would have a job because at the elementary level, it's not specific to a subject. And because even if our teacher turnover rates get better, they will have a job. Like we are losing staff. And that would be a great strategy to get people ready. And it would, I think, do the best job based on what we're seeing right now of helping to get kids caught up after a year or more of missing out on classes and instruction because of the pandemic. And because doing elementary instruction was so difficult over Zoom, especially our youngest kids who are learning how to read, you can't learn how to read and focus for 8 hours a day over Zoom when you're 6. I feel like that kind of a strategy could have the most impact at the elementary level. Although if you look at high schools, our classes are getting way too big there too. And I think maybe we use some of our unallocated to try to address class sizes at the high school level. Our class size policy was not written for COVID. It was written for times when kids did not have needs as extreme as they do right now. And I really think we should take some of this ESSER money and use it to invest in staffing so that we take some of the burden off teachers who are putting so much time into helping kids catch up in classes that are maybe would have been an okay size or maybe a little bit too big in regular times, but are way too big in the years that we're using to try to get our kids caught up after COVID. So I just want to put that out there. I'd love to hear responses. I don't think it's too late to look at how we can maybe allocate some ESSER dollars into doing that.
Well, Board Member Carusi, let me just say, first of all, thank you. You started out about students and about our staff during this pandemic. And I think all of the members here have acknowledged this. These have been unprecedented times. People are hurting in a whole lot of ways. Students haven't been without that human contact. And staff even miss that human contact. And we have been in discussions about how could we reduce the burden coming into next year and even moving beyond. I think it was Board Member Mirilli who talked about we don't know the full impact of this. And when we talk about these one-time dollars, we have to think in our budgets now locally about way out because no one really knows after these 2 years and these quick dollars, but we're anticipating it's going to be longer. So yes, we are considering what you're saying, and I don't think it's too late. We can continue to have further discussions. We're just kind of concerned about, as when we hear, we've all heard from Ross about where we are, the local dollars, and then the impact. We're trying to avoid anything that's legacy in a way. But I do think we need to have this discussion of what does that mean if we're really going to service, provide what our students need and what our staff need moving forward. So that's kind of where we are. And I know, Ross, you may have some thoughts on it as well. We've been kind of in this conversation about long-term subs and talking about for this this spring, hiring people so that we can be ready so that they can go through the training with our regular staff coming back in the fall. So Ross, you have any thoughts as well?
Similar points you made, Dr. Jenkins. What we really need to focus on right now is making sure first we can get our staff back up to capacity, not only in our permanent staffing, but in our sub-capacity staffing as well. So I understand your point, Cris. We definitely want to try and keep our class sizes within our policy as much as possible. I do think, though, we have a little bit of more work to do to ensure that every position we have advocated for, not only in our staffing process, but in our sub pool, are adequately staffed before we look at adding additional sub positions at this point. If we had the capacity to do that now, that would be wonderful. But again, with the lack of operational resources, turning to ESSER at this point might create an additional legacy burden that we would not be able to sustain after those dollars are going away. You may already know that may already be able to tell from some of the FTE identified in the executive summary that we're trying as much as possible to identify any surge positionings that don't directly affect the building level, not to keep the dollars out of the building. That's not what I'm saying, but to ensure that if and when these dollars do leave the district, that the most minimal impact would be on building level staffing as possible.
So I very much appreciate your comments about not wanting to create a structural deficit or invest too much in funding that would become legacy funding. But I honestly think that if we were to hire 20 additional teachers on ESSER dollars, we will have 20 teachers who leave the district in the next 2 years, and we would be able to absorb those positions through attrition. And we would have teachers who have MMSD experience and who've been in our classrooms prepared to step into those positions as people just naturally retire or leave the district. So I don't think legacy funding is as big an issue with something like hiring teachers. Then honestly, I think, the new positions we're hiring for the Madison Promise Academy are positions that are going to be harder. They're positions where you have to figure out where we take positions out of our regular schools to cover Madison Promise in a couple of years, because it's going to be very hard to say, oops, no more online program if we have a lot of parents who love it. It's going to be very, very hard to do that. And those 10 positions are going to have to come from somewhere, not ESSER. So I think, in some ways, staffing classroom positions is easier because you're just saying, okay, now you can move into a permanent position in this district if you choose to do so at the end of the 2 years. Those positions will be there. That also takes me to my second comment, which is about, kind of builds on what Cris was saying about really needing to understand which of these investments could become ongoing or recurring expenses over the next couple of years. Ross, I really appreciate your clarification that we're trying to keep possible recurring expenses away from the classroom. So if they can't recur, the impact on our kids is minimized. At the same time, we've already committed to almost $1.1 million in potentially recurring expenses just in our early approvals. And looking through the executive summary, I see somewhere, this includes the early approvals, but somewhere between 13 and 22 FTE that could become recurring expenses. That's $1.3 to $2.2 million that we'll have to absorb somewhere if that comes to fruition. I'm also seeing lots of programmatic things like the Madison Promise Academy, our partnership with Madison College for Early College STEM Academy. They're getting put into ESSER that are going to be very hard not to continuously fund. I think the board needs an accounting of things that have been indicated for ESSER funding that may need to be put into the permanent budget so that we can start thinking now and start planning now for how we might shift or adjust to absorb things that are going to be hard to let go of after 2 years, because they're not just a short term, let's put in an HVAC system, let's buy some more masks. It's things that are going to be hard to let go of, like mental health investments. I don't think in 2 years we're going to have a whole lot fewer kids with mental health needs. We've never been able to meet the needs of our kids who need support and help in that area. It's going to be hard to let go of those positions and those programs if we have to. I think the board needs to know now what might need to get absorbed into our budget, so we really know how to plan for the long term and how to make this sustainable. The board has a role in doing that. So if we could get some kind of just a breakdown of which of these items might need to become permanent. It would be
I
really helpful.
appreciate that, Chris. My initial response to that is not that we don't want to continue the work that we're proposing as good work. That's not what I'm trying to say in my earlier comments. What I do think is important to recognize, though, is that I'm not making the assumption that the desire to continue these projects past COVID means they automatically will be absorbed in any future budget that we're going to create. There's certainly things that we're doing on here that are great things for students and great things for our district. But as I said before, we do need to be prepared that we may not be able to continue at the same capacities, operational or otherwise. So we can certainly work on those that we think are most important in this plan, that were we to get I don't even want to say that, were we to get another $10 million tomorrow recurring authority, what we would save, but we can certainly try and do a justification of items that we know we would love to continue if given the opportunity. I'm just saying that for purposes of this budget and the short-term planning, 1 to 2 years out, we are not making any guarantees about anything we're putting forward on there right now. We simply can't. We don't have any other assurances from the state legislature that we're going to be able to do everything we want.
I appreciate that. I also know that when staff put in their applications to use ESSER money, they were able to indicate if things were recurring or not recurring. And if staff did indicate that something was to be recurring, I think the board needs to know. And hopefully we'll get those applications so we can go through them ourselves if needed and identify which items might be recurring. All right, Ollie and Savian and Nikki. And please keep in mind, we still have the whole section of this to go through, and we also have another agenda item and a closed session meeting. So let's keep comments brief.
Really quickly, I just want to say I very much agree with the priorities of making sure we have teachers in the classroom and in schools. And I really appreciate you emphasizing that that's so much of where the work of recovering from the pandemic is happening, is with our teachers and our students in classrooms. And so part of my curiosity is how much of this represents, an investment in staffing our schools in terms of, the things we've already talked about, and how do we increase direct support to schools? And Ross, I think I heard in part of your answer that you're saying we're having enough of a struggle fulfilling our regular positions that adds additional complexity to bringing on more educators. And so I want to be mindful of the kinds of vacancies we've seen this year and how that dictates our approach to staffing next year. But overwhelmingly, I very much agree with what you're saying. And I think being strategic in that effort is really important. The other thing I think is that we as a board have established that we want to have an anti-status quo approach to education, because the status quo has created the achievement gap. It has created a series of systems that we don't agree with and that haven't benefited our entire community appropriately. And so I think, when we're investing in things that we haven't invested in before and that we haven't utilized to support the vast learning capacities of our young people is something I really want us to be able to emphasize in this conversation moving forward.
Thanks, Ollie. Nikki, to close us out.
I thought Sabian was next.
I just want to say I definitely support adding as many teachers or as much support to the classroom directly as possible, and would, to that point, would want to highlight some of the initiatives I would be funding in the Department of Education, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, particularly the neighborhood builders and community builders, and really trying to embody schools in the community and what it is, schools in the community and community in the schools, and how that can translate to our grow your own programs too, in terms of bringing those individuals into the classroom and helping them get their certification to be lifetime teachers. I think when it comes to the reoccurring expenses, I think, the administration could certainly bring us a list of the high priority items, but I think the board is the ultimate decider of what we want to see reoccurring or not. I think at the end of the day, the board is going to have to decide what we cut to add these, and it's going to be our final approval at the end of the day here. So that's it.
I wanted to amplify Chris's comments. I think it's essential we use ESSER dollars to put more teachers in the classroom, 1. 2, if there are documents from the public that administration is seeing that the board isn't seeing, I'm kind of having a bit of a problem with that because I can't see the people's priority. And they believe that I have the public who believes that the board is making decisions. How could the board make decisions if we don't have the information to make that decision? And so I really think it's necessary to see not only those answers, but to see the survey results when we do those for our teachers, to see, I'm still looking for the November email saying, I've been looking down through the meeting to try and find which schools have the enrollment numbers because I can't particularly find it instead of getting an extra copy. How are we expecting a parent to get it if the board can't? It just doesn't make sense.
Nikki, I will respond to that, but Barb has been sending us Let's Talk updates periodically. That's right.
Forgot.
So they are, So, but if there's additional information we haven't received yet, then it would be great to get that. So. All right, let's move on to the final part of this presentation, budget allowances, tax levy forecast, and the stop due list.
All right, let's get this back up on screen here. Oops. Except it's not letting me. Sorry, 1 second. There. All right, for the last part of our discussion tonight, I want to go through some of the required allowances that we've built into the proposed budget. We're going to be looking at later on in this month, specifically areas of that budget that we know we need to plan for, whether we really would like to or not. Specifically, the increase for 2X independent charter schools. Every year, the portion of our enrollment that is credited to us for 2X charter enrollment, combine that with the per pupil increase that those programs get each year, will have an estimated impact of about $314,000 on this year's budget. Our open enrollment estimate net impact is about $140,000, at least estimated at this point. The only good news on that front is that because of a relatively low escalator on open enrollment payments, this is a relatively flat impact that we've seen in previous years. It's something I'm going to be continuing to monitor over the summer as we see those applications come through. But the big ones that we know we're planning for right now is that we're anticipating a rather significant renewal for our district insurance, especially liability and property. As I mentioned at the start, there's a number of concerns around cyber insurance. Many of our colleagues across the state and the nation, frankly, have been hit with a number of cyber attacks that have crippled district infrastructure. And I know that Dr. McCrae, as well as our HR team, has been working with M3 to make sure that our liability policies for our cybersecurity are up to snuff, but that's still going to likely result in a significant renewal cost to us, mostly because of the way the private market for these insurances are going. We also know that our transportation renewals for next year are going to be roughly closing in on 4%. We're still waiting on some final information there, but also our fuel costs for the fleet that we maintain for all of our routes is going to cost us considerably for next year. Again, I'm going to be continuing to monitor this with Cedric and his team to make sure that these estimates are going to hold, but I have to hold this money at this point for these purposes. Finally, through some of our earlier discussions last year, going in for the second year of MSCR seasonal staff adjustments, not to mention some of our new space leases that we're going to be working for after a lot of the building movements out of Hoyt and into the Olin Park facility, as well as other MSCR locations. In regards to our stop due list, we previewed last month that the administration is working on identification of cuts specifically out of central office to increase additional unallocated resources. The accounting of that list is here. We've cut approximately 6.5 FTE in vacant positions throughout Doyle to secure some funding for this list, as well as programmatic budgets out of Pathways and our operational renovation resources. Additionally, pulling some costs out of our long-range facility planning contractual services. We'll be using our building services budget for this going forward instead of having its own budget item, and some additional non-personnel dollars out of the student and staff supports, professional learning, and other central office budgets for additional overtime costs. And finally, I want to highlight where we're headed right now for a tax levy forecast for 22-23. Before I launch into the numbers of that, I do want to highlight something Cris mentioned at the very beginning tonight. In March, I indicated that we're going to be bringing back 2 debt defeasance recommendations to the board, in addition to the second issue of the 2020 referendum that we're going to be looking at. I had originally anticipated separating these discussions into 2 separate regular meetings to not have it be completely debt heavy. However, I do need to highlight that I'm moving these debt resolutions up to the April regular meeting for one very important reason. If you've turned on the news recently, you may have heard that interest rates are starting to climb. And considering the amounts we're looking at issuing bonds for the referendum, I wanted to give us every opportunity to mitigate what interest rates are doing right now. And I'm going to be bringing forward the referendum borrowing at the April regular meeting. Yes. And some of the additional strategies we talked about last month, which I'm showing here on the slide, is prepayment of additional referendum debt out of our existing resources to not only reduce future tax impact, but to address some of the decisions surrounding other topics we've discussed tonight around our existing Fund 10 equity. Those 2 issues are the Olson facility. There are 4 years remaining on that debt issue, approximately $5.3 million, and the 2015 maintenance referendum for $41 million. There is 1 year remaining of that issue at about $2.4 million. Combining this with the other non-referendum debt we're using for a for a budget balancing strategy is 3 of the prepayment opportunities we're talking about later this month. I issued in the board materials for tonight an updated memo that I gave the board last month outlining all of these, just so that everyone is aware of where we're headed for the April 25th discussion. So for this upcoming year, this is still a very early estimate at this point. I must indicate that, but we're looking at an approximately 2.22% total levy increase across all funds. This includes the issuing of the second issue of the referendum, the prepayment of all of the other debt resolutions we talked about tonight, and the inflationary increase in the referendum that we are able to secure in our budget balancing efforts to date. So right now we're anticipating utilizing the max revenue authority available to us. At this point, I'm previewing equalization aid loss of approximately 10%. This is a conservative estimate based on a couple of things. One, we know that there's a potential for our equalization aid to rebound after a rather unexpected reduction last year. We know that the MMSD enrollment is estimated to be down about 150 per enrollment projections from last fall. And all things combined, that's going to generate today, even with that 10% loss, actually a 20-cent reduction in the mill rate at this point, which would have an impact on the average home over approximately $85. Now, I want to make sure that people understand this is a very early estimate for a number of factors. One, I'm going to be working on an update to the board that better explains some of the equalization aid changes that happened to us last fall and what that could mean if we get an adjustment on that from last year going forward to next year. Also, in terms of spending, one thing that we've noticed during the pandemic is that spending across the state of Wisconsin has been anything but consistent. And that when we go forward into the July 1 aid estimates we get each year for what we plan to expect come October, we know there's been such significant deviation from those estimates to what we actually receive in the fall. So I think at this point, we can only improve from that negative 10% I'm estimating here, but I'm waiting on some rather key pieces before I move that number in a different location, different place. Reason I say that is because if we do move north from the negative 10% I'm previewing here, the total levy increase impact will be reduced and the mill rate will go down even further. So at this point, I'm trying to put a potential scenario on the table based on what we know now, but many things could change between now and October 15th. The graph that's shown here is showing an estimate of what increase in our 2.22 increase in our levy looks like right now. That includes an estimated increase for voucher payments. Again, voucher payments is not the same as 2X charter. Voucher payments is a dollar amount that we are given right before we set our tax levy that the district is tasked with levying for and distributing to private institutions. Increases for community services programming tied to our required allowances from the previous slides, as well as significant investments for our seasonal staff and lease costs for the coming year. And the balance of which is coming from our operating budget under our revenue limit authority at approximately $6.8 million. Keep in mind that when we talk about total tax levy increase and the revenue limit itself, the change in the tax levy is dependent on more than just change in the total revenue limit. It is dependent also on the change in our equalization aid as a whole. So at this point, with that negative 10%, some of the operational increase is coming from that aid loss, not just change in the revenue limit. Very quickly, I want to go over next steps. So as we find ourselves in the middle of April, we're going to be working this month on final budget balancing and documentation preparation for the April budget book. We're going to continue to have conversations in public session, as well as questions directly from the board if needed on any equity projects we discussed tonight. At the end of the month, we're going to be talking about all the debt resolutions that I indicated in the memo that we supplied with board materials this evening. And we'll release that draft preliminary budget to the public on April 25th. Looking forward to the next couple of months. In May and June, we're going to start our community feedback process as well as our board amendment process. As this is the first year I'm going through this, I'm going a bit from memory here, but I know that shortly after we release the budget book, we're going to make materials available to the board to submit questions on the budget book, as well as any potential amendments we may want to entertain before the June 27th vote. And we'll use the similar process again this year to collect all those questions to make sure everyone feels comfortable moving forward with that time frame. That leads us into the end of June, where we will hopefully be putting forward our June preliminary budget book for board discussion and vote that evening. So with that, I will turn it back over to Cris for any final questions on the presentation tonight.
Thank you, Ross. Nikki, I see your hand.
Yes, just one. Is there, I didn't hear right, is there tax levy negative 10 or 1.0? I could not hear you.
I'm sorry. So no, the tax levy projected increase today is 2.22%. The negative 10% right now is on our general aid for the state, general aid, equalization aid, sorry. They're usually used in a similar discussion. But in the overall revenue limit, the estimated tax impact right now is an increase of 2.22%, which includes a 10% reduction in equalization aid.
Got it. Thank you. That's it.
Sabian, do I see your hand? Oh, okay. Ross, I have one question, and that is, last year between June and October, we had two surprises when it came to the tax levy. One was a radically different valuation of property in Madison, and the other was more enrollment, declining enrollment revenue and hold harmless aid than we thought we were going to get. So to address, if we were to run into another similar situation with hold harmless and declining enrollment, last year it seemed like a good strategy to under levy. Is that kind of the plan for this year?
If we find ourselves in that situation again, and I honestly hope we do not, that would be my plan, is that I would not be looking in the last final weeks of budget preparation to find a way to spend one-time money that really happened without any planning or forethought.
Thanks for that. I agree with you completely. And I also hope it doesn't happen. Also, do you think there's a chance we could have a similar surprise when it comes to equalized property value as we had last year? Because that was a shock, not only to our budget, but also to our taxpayers.
It was. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be working on an update to go back over that situation. While it was very frustrating, it is something we had absolutely zero control over. And if I point to the resources I have available, I will work to help illustrate to the board how this came to be and why I think that an error was made. Frankly, I don't want to get to the point where, or I can't say we're going to get to the point where a resolution is going to affect anything we did this year, because honestly, that's not possible. But in short, the valuation we're given in the fall, we must use that valuation, right or wrong, to set our tax levy. And what happened in our adjustment to the city of Madison was a negative 1% in our equalized value for the city of Madison, where every other municipality in our footprint went up from 4 to 6%. So it didn't make sense. It was our largest piece of our equalized value. To see such a drastic reduction in that didn't add up. The discussions I had with our state partners, not only at the city assessor's office, but the Department of Revenue, identified that a flat 10% reduction was made in commercial property in the fall that really could not be explained to me. So I don't want to go too far down the realm of conjecture, but I do think an honest error was made in that valuation that resulted in that 1% reduction overall, because on that same form, you see the same level of average home value increase that we saw from the city assessor's office. So my understanding is the average home value in Madison has been going up the last 5 years, not down. So what we encountered seems to be a rather frustrating correction on commercial property that affected the municipality as a whole. So I'm going to work to summarize this just so that the board is aware of what I was able to find on this. And if we do get a correction on this valuation, it would appear in our May statement of values that we would be using for aid projections for next year, which is another reason I'm still at negative 10%. That adjustment could tank the July 1 aid estimate. But again, too early to tell at this point. I don't want to catastrophize this too much, but that adjustment will affect our aid projections for fall. It will not affect anything in the current year. Nothing about our aid certification can be changed for this year at this point. It's simply an update or a correction if one is made.
So another way to phrase that would be that if our equalization aid changes, it doesn't affect our budget, it affects the tax levy, correct?
That is accurate. So it initially affects our aid appropriation in the fall, which we would then use to set our final tax levy.
Okay.
So it's a dependent variable upon a dependent variable.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful as we approach the very important question of the tax levy moving forward. My final request is I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit more detail about the amendment process moving forward. One of our goals with the budget is to address potential amendments or changes early on, so there's no surprises at the moment we're taking the budget vote. So what's the time frame for proposing budget amendments, and what do board members do if they have an idea for a budget amendment?
You bet. So looking into notes I was able to find from last year, the budget amendment process we will launch shortly after the April regular meeting. Proposed amendments will be submitted from board members after May 1st and ending at the end of May to make sure we have the ability to process any potential amendments. The goal of that will be to try and address any potential amendments before they actually get made on the floor so that we can adequately plan for them and incorporate them into the budget vote based on that discussion. We do want to request that any amendments that are submitted are as detailed and specific as possible, so that if we are proposing, for example, large new spending areas, that we're able to identify how we can pay for these instead of just identifying a new area in the budget to just add. We would need any amendments to be worked collaboratively between the board and the administration to identify that something can be funded and that we have a way to do so before we incorporate it into the budget document. I'm going to be working with Dr. Jenkins over the next several weeks to clarify how these are going to come in. My goal would be to make sure that the amendments come through my office as well as Dr. Jenkins and Dr. McGregory, just to make sure that we have the ability to spread any questions out as much as possible. And we do want those requests to be given to us in a way that we can investigate them and adequately respond to the board in a timely fashion so that we can incorporate that into that June planning.
Thank you so much, Ross, for explaining that process. And, the board has the right to amend anything at any time when we're voting on it. That said, I think amendments are going to be better and have a much better chance of getting worked into the budget if people put them out early. So I would strongly encourage board members who are thinking about budget amendments to get them out during the month of May, during that window. So there's time to actually think about how we can get them in the budget and make them happen. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else on the budget? Seeing no hands. Ross, I want to give you huge thanks, not only for all of your work for this meeting, but for the fabulous work we've done together for this past year. I'm going to miss working with you. It's been great.
You as well, Cris. Thank you for your partnership.
All right, let's move on to the employee handbook.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. So just want to be quick. The handbook review committee has been meeting every month since June 2021. Our agenda is fluid. In there, I've put in a couple of thoughts that we've been looking at. The one thing that we have done, we've had a lot of good discussions using a collaborative process, but we're also having to work under the confines of Act 10. So it kind of stalls a little bit, but other than that, everything is going well. We're moving right along. We have some points that we're looking at, and so we're trying to move towards starting to put those ideas into place.
Tracy, so this is an opportunity, this is just an informational item at this point. There's no imminent action on the handbook, but we wanted to make sure the board had the opportunity to ask questions, particularly since we have had staff and MTI contacting us about the handbook process. And I wanted to make sure we had a chance for a public discussion to all get on the same page. So Nikki, I see your hand up.
Multiple things. One, can we please get a list of the priorities from both sides on what exactly that were being discussed? Two, can a board member attend a bargaining session? I know MMSD, I know that it had been asked by MTI. I never got an answer if I can or can't. And I've looked at the board rules and I've looked at the statutes and neither are clear. So I'm curious if that is allowed. And three, I don't understand some of the canceled meetings. Is that due to scheduling changes because of COVID?
Nikki, before Tracy jumps in with her answer, I want to clarify that the work on the handbook is not bargaining. We actually can't bargain on the handbook. It's just collaborative planning. So
I said the wrong word. That's totally my fault. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay. So to answer the first question, I did put in the recommendations that we have. So I put in the MMSD recommendations and I put in the MTI recommendations. And these are the things that we discussed during our meetings to try to come up with a plan. The other piece is for the board. Now I'm going by what's in the handbook. So at the first paragraph that I put in there is that we make revisions on which the review committee can reach consensus will be forwarded by the superintendent to the board for final approval. So that's the process that we're trying to work through.
Okay. But it doesn't say I can't sit through it, correct? If I don't talk.
You probably could. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into it. It doesn't say that you can't, but it also doesn't have in there that we have a board member on the committee, but you probably could, depending on what we're talking about though too. That's the other issue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I just want to weigh in really quickly that I am comfortable with a board member participating as long as it's a collaboration between our union, our administration, and us as a board. And so I think defining what that looks like is something we have to come together to do. And I can follow up with you about that, Nikki.
I'd love to. Yeah, I just want to sit there. I've never seen one.
I also would like to ask just a couple questions about this process. So I very much appreciate that you're engaging in this process. Cris, I want to thank you for making sure this is on our agenda. You described the process as going well so far. Can you talk to us about where there's kind of common ground between the administration and MTI in terms of the handbook, and where our areas of tension may be in terms of how we're coming together to talk about the handbook?
I won't say there's tension. I just think we have there are some impasses, that there are things that I can't talk about. As I said before, we are working within the confines of Act 10. So there's certain things that we can't talk about. And so we're trying to use a collaborative process to get around those issues and to come up with pulling it all back into the handbook and where the changes can be made, because the current handbook has yellow highlights. So from what I was told, that is the changes that were made. And so we're looking more into the wording as opposed to having good discussions on what we're looking to change. So for instance, if you look at what I put in there for revisions, like section 18, looking at that, because when you look at section 18, it says you would come together every 2 years or as needed. And so that's a question that's come up is it as needed, and where we are in the process from where it left off before COVID, before it stopped. So I won't say it's tension, like I said, we're using the collaborative process.
So I want to be clear about my question. I was asking specifically, are there areas of common ground within our handbook, areas in which the administration and our union, our educators are on the same page versus areas of disagreement or areas of tension? And I guess I kind of missed any specific area that you would be kind of referencing. So I understand, I'm not asking you to talk about anything you can't talk about because of Act 10. I'm simply asking you to describe the process that you've engaged in and where folks are on the same page and where folks are not on the same page in terms of our handbook.
So the process is this, is that we come up with some subject matters, they come up with some subject matters, we come together and we look to find common ground on what we want to look at and change and work on for the handbook. So that's the process that we use. We talk a lot about equity. We look at what would be equitable, where can we make changes, can we consolidate some areas, or some areas like a one-off that we can use. So that's kind of the collaborative process that we're using. And those are the common grounds that we do have.
I think what I'm asking more specifically is what are the areas that have been identified as common ground? So like, we got together and agreed that this needs to shift in terms of our practices around seniority, or this needs to shift in terms of, you know, how we can have more equitable hiring practices. And that's an area in which we're on the same page versus, you know, here's an area where the administration thinks were we to take this action, we would be able to advance this work. The union doesn't necessarily agree with that. Are there kind of salient examples of areas that have been defined through this process?
That goes back to what you're looking at as far as what is needed, for instance, like for each positions or each work unit, we're looking at what each work unit is looking for, what equity, what is equitable within those work units. So we have to be careful. Like I said, that's where you get into the whole Act 10. So we want to stay away from wages, wage schedules, but talk more about uniformity in how the handbook pertains to each of those units. And so when I talk about section 18, the handbook revisions and review, looking at that. So we're looking more at the sections, making them more equitable, making them more equal. And that's where I'm talking about when I said before with your question, is that making it one handbook for everyone. And then if you have some of the sections, but you don't want, because to me, the handbook is, you have parts of it, and then it goes into all the different units. What we're saying is bring it all together. And then if there's certain parts that may need to come out, that's what we're looking at. So that's where the equity comes in, to make it one handbook without all the sections put together. If that makes.
I don't have any other questions.
All right, Dr. Jenkins.
Yes, thank you so much for having this topic here so we can just talk about it in the open. But then there are some things, I thank you too, Ms. Caradine, because there are some things that we talk about in the group as a part of, since I've been here, what we've been trying to do is have a collaborative problem solving process, even with the handbook and everything we do. And Mike Jones and I have a cadence when we meet a lot of Fridays. He typically meets with Dr. McGregory too, a lot of Fridays. But if there are things that are happening in the handbook that are not necessarily moving forward, I'm hoping and expecting that Mike and I are going to have these conversations, and then we can talk about it. And we just raised amongst administration about it's time for us to have another collaborative problem solving workshop together with the union to make sure how we go about having a cadence of having these discussions. I do not expect that we will agree on everything, and we don't have to respectfully disagree, but I do think that we can find common ground on things, just as when you were asking the question, Chair Moultrie, one thing I was very proud of, we both talked about moving forward and being about our children, that we want to be this whole thing of an anti-racist district, but a discovery of what does that mean to be like an anti-racist district for real. And I think that there are some topics in terms of wanting our staff to have a great working conditions in place, but what does that mean to MTI? What does that mean to us? And how do we get there together? Now, it is my hope that through our collaborative problem solving, we can find more things that we agree on than we disagree on, in the ultimate thing, knowing that we all are here for our students. So I'm interested in, and I think I would myself go to one of the meetings as well, but I'm looking to go back and have this conversation with Mike Jones first and see what he and I think needs to happen collaboratively, but there needs to be some additional discussion between he and I as we move forward. But I'm glad we're having this discussion here too, because it's great to hear from the board. Are there things, if you, I'd much rather be with us and not everybody having to come to you for something that we agree that we can have some real discussion about.
Thanks, Dr. Jenkins. Cris?
Yeah, thank you. And Ms. Caradine, please stop me if you have already explained this. I had to step out for just a minute, but I am curious with the timeline on this. So looking at this, is this just an ongoing process, or is there a start time and an end point to this? So what I see here is recommendations from MMSD and from MTI on your memo. Is there an ending point that you are hoping to get to for one of these years and then a new year would start?
Yes.
Timeline wise, okay.
Yes. Yeah, we are looking to, once we figure out which sections we want to focus on and look at language and agree on language, then yes, there will be a stop time. And then we want to do like a full year where we don't touch the handbook. We use it for one full year. And then if we have to start another year, or that's why I talk about section 18, because what is in there is that there would be a repository where people can put in suggestions for changes to the handbook. And then so that would be the second year you start looking at those and then start working on it. And then you go through this process all over again. But there would be 1 year where you would just leave the handbook as is and go through 1 year cycle.
So the collaborative process you're involved in right now, are you expecting that to go through May, through June, through July? Where is the endpoint that you're expecting for this year and what you are working on right now?
So the endpoint would be, we would make suggestions in May to work on it for June. If I'm not mistaken, from the handbook, yes.
Okay, so you're hoping to have this resolved by June, and then moving forward on from that would be a new collaborative process. So I have, right, okay. One of the things, just because we just got done talking about budget, if you end up wanting to act on any of these recommendations, it does seem like some of them are attached to pay or budget. Things like the co-curricular event pay that I see on here. And I do understand that has been an issue over the past year, just due to staffing and COVID and getting people to be able to do some of these things in our schools. If that were to be addressed, and I'm not saying what the decision is going to be, but where do you see that fitting into the budget process for next year?
I can't answer that. I'm not sure.
Okay. Is that something we can't answer just because we're still discussing it? Or I'm just thinking planning wise, we're releasing a budget for next year in April, our preliminary budget, and then the final budget in June, at the end of June.
Yeah. I can't, and like I said, again, I can't really answer that.
I think we have to differentiate. If I may address this, board member Gomez-Schmidt.
Yes, please.
In the handbook committee, typically we can address the issues of compensation. So if you're talking about the handbook piece, the other budgetary pieces that have to be addressed through the budgetary process. So I don't think typically the handbook committee, which I'm actually not on, can address those types of things because those are to deal with compensation.
Okay, so then I guess I'm curious, the ones that you have listed here as MTI recommendations, why are these coming to us through the handbook committee then, if that isn't possible?
Well, those are subject matters that they would like to talk about, that they want us as the handbook committee to look at and work on. So I wanted to be transparent and put those in there because those are recommendations that they want us to talk about.
Okay, is this something we cannot talk about though in the handbook process? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, right now I can't, yeah.
But are you
We can
able?
look at it. What we're doing is we're looking at it, we're discussing it, trying to get an understanding of what they're looking at and what they want to happen. And so that's where we do the collaborative processes. We're listening, we're getting an understanding of where they're coming from with that. So we are doing that much.
Okay, and then through the process, do you provide them feedback on the district's opinions on the things they're suggesting, and then they respond to that feedback? I'm just trying to get a handle on how the whole process works.
So that's for our next meeting, that's what we're looking at. But for right now, I can't give them a definitive answer, but we are listening. They did give us some ideas of how they want that to look and how they want it tied to different areas within the handbook as well. And so we are looking at it. We are meeting, we do breakout sessions, we come back and they kind of give us an understanding of what they're looking for and how they want that to be fleshed out.
And Cris, I just want to just mention one additional piece. We have to be very careful when we can do collaborative problem solving. However, as Ms. Carradine has indicated, in these meetings, she cannot respond to a request, for example, to increase payment for a particular group of employees. All she can say is, I hear your request. And so there is no back and forth. It's, I hear your request. And that's about the extent, but that's because of the strictures of Act 10. So the focus should not be on really compensation. It should be on everything else that's in the handbook.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think that is important as to what is negotiable and what is part of a collaborative solving, problem solving process that we are trying to engage in. I guess one of the things I would comment is I do think it's important to figure out the time frame. To me, 3 years seems like a really long time when we've been working on a yearly cycle, but I guess I would want to know more about how that would work. And then my question is what do you need from the board at this point in the process? How can we?
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's my question for you.
And so in the handbook, it's every 2 years. It's every 2 years in the handbook, but from what I understand, they've been doing it every year. But technically, it's an every 2 year cycle to look at the handbook. And what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
Oh, just if there's, I know I appreciate the update on the handbook process. I'm just wondering if there's any like decision point or anything coming up that you would need from the board.
At this point, not yet, but soon. Because what will happen is we'll do the write-up and we'll give it to the superintendent and then take it from there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Cris, Nikki, I see your hand.
Quick question, and this is for, I want to ask Sherry to make sure I could legally ask it. So Sherry could come on screen, that would be wonderful. And that is this, can we please explain why we canceled multiple meetings? Was it due to COVID? Was it due to that? I have a list of dates that was set by the union on meetings that were canceled. Are we allowed to ask why they were canceled and who canceled them and the reason for the cancellation?
Well, I can answer those two, Sherry, and then you can jump in if you want. So the two that were canceled one was a signing day. The other one was another career fair that we had. And then the other one, I was dealing with a work issue. So those are the only ones that have been canceled.
And thank you.
I've got a couple of questions. And the first one is just about in the memo, the list of items that MTI has brought forward is much shorter than the list that was in their memo that they shared with us in March. So I'm wondering how we got from that fairly long list of things that they're interested in talking about to the list of 4 items in the memo.
They pared it down because we were like, it's monumental. I mean, that's enormous. And so we were like, can you pare it down to specific ones? Let's just focus on maybe 4. So we brought 4 things, they brought 4 things, and then we kind of to pare it down.
Yeah, I hadn't heard from MTI that they had pared it down. So that's clarification.
Mhm.
And then my other concern is that I firmly disagree with the proposal to extend the collaborative handbook process to a 3-year cycle instead of a 2-year cycle. Just as a board member, this 2-year cycle is really important for us to stay on top of what our staff are thinking in terms of their working conditions and changes they want to see. And if we extend this to a 3-year cycle, that's less time that we have to get that important feedback from our staff in an established process and a structured process. So I really think, just in the interest of making sure that this board is on top of working conditions in the district and what our staff are thinking and saying, as well as the need to continuously collaborate with our staff over some of these things, we should keep it as a 3-year process. I know collaborative planning or collaborative problem solving is
3 years.
no, keep it at 2. Sorry.
Like,
I'm tired.
Body language too, but you're saying 3.
My body is saying 2 and my mouth said 2. Yeah, I'd keep it at 2. I know that collaborative problem solving is an ongoing process, and I very much appreciate that, but the board is not engaged with that process at the same levels we engage with the handbook, because the handbook process says we have to engage. So I think we need to maintain some kind of a formal structured process for the board to be hearing from our staff about what their concerns are and what their interests are and their excitement is around the handbook, and know how the administration is responding to those things.
Thank you for that.
Other comments on the handbook? Or move on to our next thing.
We want to agree that I think if we're in a 3-year cycle, just based in the board's terms, that it's almost impossible to have a continual conversation. And I'll also say that the last time we as a board took action around the handbook, it was a really debated area of action that we took. And we took that action expecting for it to create specific results. And I think if we don't have this conversation on a regular basis, we don't have the ability to determine whether or not our decisions are having the impact we intend for them to have. And so I think, being able to examine this conversation and re-examine the decisions we're making within this conversation is incredibly important.
Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with both of you. And thank you again, Board Member Carusi, for making sure that this item is for discussion.
Okay, moving on for our next agenda item, I'm going to hand it over to Board President.
I'm gonna pass it to Board Vice President Xavier Castro. He's got the document.
Thank you so much. And this is a resolution to recognize departing board members Cris Carusi and Ananda Mirilli. Whereas Cris Carusi and Ananda Mirilli, Board of Education members for the Madison Metropolitan School District, have successfully served on the board since 2019. Whereas leadership of Cris and Ananda during the unprecedented time of the COVID-19 pandemic have demonstrated their perseverance and humanity in countless ways over the past 2 years, and has helped the district keep our students, staff, and families safe. Whereas the support and outreach taken on by Ananda and Cris to help pass the 2020 referendum has put the district in a place where all students will benefit from the massive upgrades to physical spaces and bolstering of MMSD's finances could not have come at a more opportune time. Whereas their fierce dedication to highlighting racial disparities that must be addressed both in K-12 education and larger society continues to uplift our students. Whereas Ananda's leadership on the City of Madison Education Committee has brought together city, county, and district for collaborative problem solving. Whereas staff was honored to work with Ananda as chair of the instruction work group and Cris as chair of the operations work group, fostering positive relationships and mutual respect and support of high quality instruction. Whereas both members have kept equity at the center of the conversations, prioritized educators, honored our community, and centered our students. Whereas their service will shape education in our community for generations of young people and inspire the leadership of both the board members they leave behind and those who will follow in their footsteps. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Madison Metropolitan School District Board of Education recognizes and greatly values the contributions of Cris Carusi and Ananda mirilli and their dedication to MMSD students. Their work and legacy will continue to have a lasting positive impact in our schools, our students, our families, and the community. Be it further resolved, the statement be permanently imprinted in the Board of Education minutes for the meeting of April 11th, 2022.
Present a couple of plaques that we usually give to outgoing board members. It's a wonderful thing that we get through our Wisconsin Association of School Board Organization. Has a little inscription on it for each of you.
Thank you. The funny thing is that you would think this is the end, but you have another meeting after this meeting. Yeah, go ahead.
And on that note, Board President Muldrow, do you want to take a recess between the two meetings?
So I need to adjourn this one.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you like if pre-planning.
Oh, yes, we can take a recess in between, so we can take a few minutes.
We'll take a few minutes. Okay. On that note, I will ask if there's a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Second.
All right, all those in favor? Gordon, can I get your advisory vote?
Aye.
All those in favor? Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
We'll come back at 8:05. 8:06.